Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's most dangerous and deliberately suppressed professions, the secret world of women healers who risked everything to practice medicine when doing so could cost them their lives. These weren't amateurs or superstitious peasants dabbling in folk magic. They were skilled practitioners with real medical knowledge, performing surgeries in hiding, delivering babies, creating medicines that actually worked, and being burned as witches for doing exactly what male doctors were celebrated for doing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. What if I told you that in medieval Europe, the most skilled surgeons were often women who had to operate in secret, that midwives had lower maternal mortality rates than university-trained male physicians but were systematically targeted and eliminated, that women herbalists created effective medicines for pain, infection, and disease centuries before male pharmacists discovered the same compounds, and that the witch hunts that killed hundreds of thousands of people were largely campaigns to eliminate female medical practitioners and transfer their patients and their knowledge to male doctors. What if you discovered that some of the most important medical advances were made by women whose names we'll never know because they couldn't publish their discoveries, couldn't attend medical schools, couldn't join professional guilds, and were threatened with execution if they practiced openly? Tonight you are going to meet women who performed cesarean sections and saved both mother and baby when male doctors would have let both die. Women who created anesthetics from plants and performed painless surgeries centuries before ether was invented. Women who understood germ theory and antiseptic technique long before Pasteur and Lister made those discoveries a fic. And women who treated plague victims, set broken bones, removed tumours, delivered babies, created birth control, performed abortions, and healed wounds using methods that actually worked, and who were called witches and murdered for their trouble. You are going to learn about the systematic campaign to eliminate female healers and how it succeeded in transferring medical practice from women to men, from effective folk medicine to often deadly academic medicine, and from free community-based care to expensive fee-based professional practice. According to research by Professor Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English, whose groundbreaking work Witches, Midwives and Nurses, A History of Women Healers, examines the suppression of female medical practice. For most of human history, healing was primarily women's work. Women attended births, treated childhood diseases, cared for the elderly, created medicines from plants, set bones, treated wounds, and provided the vast majority of medical care for their communities. This wasn't because there were no male healers. There were, but because women's knowledge was passed mother to daughter, because women's work included caregiving, because women had access to other women's bodies in ways men didn't, and because healing was understood as part of women's natural role rather than as a profession requiring formal education or licensing. According to Professor Ehrenreich's analysis, this began to change in medieval Europe when medicine started to become professionalized, when universities were established that excluded women, when medical guilds were formed that banned female practitioners, and when the Catholic Church began to assert control over healing as part of its broader control over people's bodies and lives. Women healers became threats to male physicians who wanted to eliminate competition, to the church which saw women's knowledge as potentially heretical and women's independence as dangerous, and to the growing medical establishment that wanted to monopolize practice and profit from healthcare rather than providing community-based care. Think about that for a moment. You are going to spend tonight exploring a world where providing medical care as a woman was illegal and punishable by death, where knowing how to deliver a baby safely or create a fever, reducing tea could get you accused of witchcraft, where success as a healer made you more suspect rather than less, because if your treatments worked when priests' prayers failed, that was evidence of demonic assistance rather than medical skill. This wasn't ancient history. This campaign against female healers intensified from the 14th through the 17th centuries, right when European medicine was supposedly becoming more scientific and advanced, and its effects persist today in the gender imbalances in medicine and in the dismissal of traditional healing knowledge. Let me tell you about Agnes Bernauer, because her story illuminates the deadly risks female healers faced, and how accusations of witchcraft were used to eliminate women who practiced medicine. According to research by Professor Lyndall Roper from Oxford University, whose work examines witch trials in early modern Germany, Agnes Bernauer was a surgeon's daughter in Augsburg, Germany in the early 15th century. She learned medicine from her father and became known as a skilled healer in her own right, treating wounds, setting bones, and performing minor surgeries. She was also beautiful, and she caught the attention of Duke Albrecht III of Bavaria, who fell in love with her and married her secretly in 1432, despite her common birth. According to Professor Roper's analysis, Agnes's medical practice became dangerous when she became a duchess. Her father-in-law, Duke Ernst, opposed the marriage and wanted it annulled so his son could make a politically advantageous match. When Albrecht refused to leave Agnes, Duke Ernst had her arrested on charges of witchcraft. The specific accusation was that she had used magic and potions to enchant the young duke. In other words, her medical knowledge and her ability to create effective medicines was reframed as evidence of witchcraft and demonic power. In 1435, Agnes was tried, convicted, and executed by drowning in the Danube River. Despite having committed no crime except marrying above her station and knowing too much about medicine, what is crucial to understand about Agnes's case, according to Professor Roper, is that her medical knowledge was both what made her useful and what made her vulnerable. As long as she was treating common people and working in her father's shadow, her healing practice was tolerated. But when she became visible, powerful, and threatening to male authority, when she was a duchess who knew medicine and therefore didn't need to depend on court physicians, when she was a woman who could create medicines and therefore held knowledge that men wanted to control, her medical practice became evidence of witchcraft, and witchcraft became grounds for execution. Think about what this meant for women healers throughout Europe. If you were too successful, if your treatments worked too well, if you threatened male physicians or male power in any way, your medical knowledge could be reframed as witchcraft and you could be executed. The very skills that made you valuable to your community made you vulnerable to accusations that could get you killed. You had to be good enough at healing that people sought your help, but not so good that you attracted the wrong kind of attention, not so successful that you threatened the male medical establishment, not so knowledgeable that men in power saw you as dangerous. According to Professor Roper's research, Agnes Bernauer's case was far from unique. Throughout Germany in the 15th and 16th centuries, women healers were disproportionately targeted in witch trials. Analysis of trial records reveals that women accused of witchcraft were often midwives, herbalists, or other types of healers, and that the accusations frequently involved their medical practice, claims that they had killed patients when actually the patient died from disease, that they had used magic potions when actually they used herbal medicines, that they had caused miscarriages or stillbirths when they attended difficult births as midwives, or that they had caused impotence or infertility when they provided contraceptive advice or refused sexual advances. Let me tell you about the specific medical practices that got women accused of witchcraft and killed, because understanding what they actually did versus what they were accused of reveals how the witch hunts functioned to suppress female medical knowledge. According to research by Professor Silvia Federici from Hofstra University, whose work Caliban and the Witch examines the connection between witch hunts and the rise of capitalism, 3 types of female healing practice were especially targeted: midwifery, abortion and contraception, and pain management. Professor Federici's research reveals that midwives were systematically targeted during the witch hunts for several reasons. First, they had medical knowledge that male physicians lacked. They understood childbirth from attending hundreds of births. They had techniques for managing complications that university-trained doctors had never learned, and they had lower mortality rates than male physicians who attended births. Second, they had power over life and death in a very immediate way. They decided whether a baby or mother would live or die in difficult births. They could provide or withhold life-saving care, and they were the ones women trusted with their most vulnerable moments. Third, they practiced outside male supervision and control. They worked in women's spaces. They were paid by women. They answered to communities of women rather than to male authorities. According to Professor Federici, the most common accusation against midwives was that they killed babies or caused stillbirths. In reality, infant and maternal mortality were high in this period due to disease, malnutrition, and lack of medical knowledge. But when babies died, midwives could be blamed and accused of deliberately killing them through witchcraft. Some midwives were accused of using babies' body parts for magical rituals. In reality, they may have performed autopsies to understand what went wrong, or they may have disposed of stillborn infants' bodies in ways that seemed suspicious to accusers who didn't understand medical necessity. Think about what this meant for women in labour. Imagine you are giving birth in 16th century Europe, and you know that if something goes wrong, if your baby dies, or if you die, your midwife might be accused of witchcraft and executed. Imagine you are a midwife, and you know that every birth you attend is a potential death sentence. Not because the birth might be dangerous to you, but because if the outcome is bad, despite your best efforts, you might be blamed and killed for it. This created a situation where the most experienced and skilled midwives were the most vulnerable because they were the ones called for the most difficult cases, the ones most likely to see bad outcomes, and therefore the ones most likely to be accused. According to Professor Federici's research, the second major area where female healers were targeted was providing contraception and abortion. Women had knowledge of plants and techniques that could prevent pregnancy or end early pregnancies. Pennyroyal, tansy, ergot, and other herbs that affected fertility and menstruation, as well as mechanical methods like douching and pessaries. This knowledge was passed between women and was part of women's traditional medical practice. But it was also profoundly threatening to authorities, to the church, which wanted to control women's sexuality and reproduction, to the state, which wanted to ensure population growth for labour and military forces, and to men generally, who wanted control over women's reproductive capacity. Providing contraception or abortion could get a female healer accused of witchcraft on several grounds. She might be accused of killing unborn children, of causing sterility or impotence in men, when actually she was helping women prevent pregnancy, of using demonic knowledge to interfere with God's plan, or of participating in heretical sexual practices. According to Professor Federici, the systematic elimination of women's control over their own fertility through attacking the female healers who provided reproductive health care was a crucial part of establishing male control over women's bodies and women's labour in the emerging capitalist economy. Now let me tell you about the third area of dangerous female medical practice: pain management and anaesthesia. According to Professor Federici's research, women healers had extensive knowledge of pain-relieving plants and techniques. They used opium poppies, hemp, mandrake, henbane, belladonna, and other plants with analgesic and anesthetic properties to manage pain during surgery, childbirth, and illness. They understood dosing. They knew how to prepare these substances for maximum effectiveness and minimum toxicity, and they successfully performed procedures that would have been unbearably painful without their anesthetics. But this knowledge was dangerous for multiple reasons. First, many of the plants used for pain relief were also poisonous in higher doses, so women herbalists who knew how to use them were suspected of being poisoners. Second, the Catholic Church taught that pain, especially pain in childbirth, was divinely ordained punishment for sin, and that relieving this pain was interfering with God's will. The Bible's statement that women should bear children in pain was interpreted literally, and women who helped other women avoid this pain were seen as heretics. Third, the ability to relieve pain gave female healers power that male physicians lacked in an era when surgery was agonizing, and many people refused it or died from surgical shock. A healer who could perform painless surgery had an enormous advantage. According to Professor Federici, women healers who used pain-relieving herbs were accused of using witches' ointments or devil's potions, and the effectiveness of their anesthetics was used as evidence of demonic assistance rather than medical skill. The more effective a woman's pain management, the more suspect she became. If she could make pain disappear when priests' prayers couldn't, that suggested supernatural power, and supernatural power in a woman could only come from the devil. Let me tell you about specific herbal medicines that women healers used, and that got them accused of witchcraft, because understanding their actual pharmacological effects reveals how real medical knowledge was reframed as magic. According to research by Professor Harold Speert from Columbia University, whose work examines the history of obstetrics, medieval and early modern women herbalists used plants that modern pharmacology has confirmed have genuine medicinal properties. Professor Speert's research reveals that ergot, derived from a fungus that grows on rye, was used by midwives to speed labour and reduce postpartum hemorrhaging. Ergot contains compounds that cause uterine contractions and constrict blood vessels, which is why it is effective for these purposes, and why modern obstetric medicine still uses ergot derivatives, like methylergonavine, for the same purposes. But medieval midwives who used ergot were accused of using a poison and of practicing witchcraft, even though their use of this medicine saved women's lives by stopping dangerous bleeding after childbirth. According to Professor Speert, willow bark was used by female healers for pain relief and fever reduction. Willow bark contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Women healers understood through empirical observation that willow bark tea reduced pain and fever, and they used it to treat headaches, arthritis, and inflammatory condition. This was real medicine, not magic, but because women couldn't explain the biochemical mechanism, and because their knowledge came from tradition rather than university education, it was dismissed as superstition by male physicians and could be used as evidence of witchcraft if a healer was accused. Foxglove, which women healers used to treat irregular heartbeat and fluid retention, contains digitalis, still used in modern cardiac medicine. Cinchona bark, used by indigenous women healers in South America and then by European women who learned from them, contains quinine, the first effective treatment for malaria and still used today. Poppies provided opium for pain relief. Hemp provided pain relief and reduced nausea. Henbane and mandrake provided anesthesia for surgery. All of these were real medicines with real effects, and all of them were part of women's traditional healing knowledge that was reframed as witchcraft and used to justify killing female healers. Think about what this reveals about the witch hunts. Women weren't being killed for practicing fake medicine or superstitious magic. They were being killed for practicing real medicine that actually worked, for having medical knowledge that threatened male physicians, for treating patients successfully, and therefore competing with university-trained doctors, and for providing healthcare to communities in ways that didn't generate profit for the emerging medical profession. The more effective a woman's healing practice was, the more dangerous her position became. Now, let me tell you about the trochlea, because this text illuminates both the real medical knowledge women possessed, and how that knowledge was systematically erased and attributed to men. According to research by Professor Monica Green from Arizona State University, whose work examines medieval women's medicine, the trochlea is a collection of medieval medical texts on women's medicine, particularly gynecology, obstetrics, and cosmetics, that was enormously influential throughout Europe for centuries. The texts were attributed to Trochlea di Ruggiero, a female physician who allegedly practiced in Salerno, Italy in the 11th or 12th century. Professor Green's research reveals that the Trotula texts contain sophisticated medical knowledge about women's health, including treatments for infertility, remedies for difficult menstruation, techniques for managing difficult births, methods for preventing and treating infections, and advice on cosmetics and hygiene. The texts show clear evidence of being written from a female perspective and for a female audience. They discuss topics that women would know about from experience. They use language that suggests the author was female, and they address concerns that matter to women. According to Professor Green, what is remarkable about the Trotula is what happened to it over time. As medicine became increasingly professionalized and male-dominated in the later medieval period, copyists and editors began to masculinize the text. References to the author as female were changed to make the author male. The name Trotula was reinterpreted as a male name. Passages that were too explicitly female in perspective were edited or removed, and the text was gradually transformed from a woman's medical text into a standard medical text, supposedly written by a man. By the early modern period, most people believed Trotula was a man, and some scholars argued that the entire text must have been written by men, because women couldn't possibly have possessed such sophisticated medical knowledge. Think about what this erasure meant. Real medical knowledge created by women was attributed to men, and then the fact that the knowledge was male was used as evidence that women didn't and couldn't create such knowledge. Women's medical expertise was made invisible, and that invisibility was then used to justify excluding women from medicine on the grounds that they had never contributed to medical knowledge. This pattern of erasure and attribution happened not just with the Trotula but throughout medical history. Women's discoveries were stolen, their names were forgotten, their contributions were minimized, and their expertise was denied. According to Professor Green's research, the real Trotula, whether she was one woman or several women whose work was compiled, represented a tradition of female medical practice in Salerno that was remarkable for its time. Salerno had a medical school that, unusually for medieval Europe, allowed women to study and practice medicine. Female physicians in Salerno treated both women and men. They taught medical students, they wrote medical texts, and they were respected members of the medical community. But this was exceptional. Most places in Europe excluded women from formal medical education and practice. And even in Salerno, women's access to medical training declined over time, as the medical school became more influenced by university models that excluded women. Let me tell you about specific women healers whose names we know and whose stories illuminate the dangers they faced. According to research by Professor Diane Watt from the University of Surrey, whose work examines medieval women's writing, one of the most famous female medical practitioners was Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess who wrote extensively on medicine and natural history. Hildegard's medical texts describe hundreds of plants, animals and minerals and their medicinal uses, recommend treatments for various diseases, and demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology. Professor Watt's research reveals that Hildegard was able to practice and write about medicine because she operated within the protection of the church. As an abbess of a wealthy monastery, she had status and protection that ordinary women healers lacked. But even Hildegard was careful to frame her medical knowledge as coming from divine visions, rather than from empirical observation or traditional women's knowledge, because claiming that knowledge came from God made it acceptable in ways that claiming women could simply know things through observation and experience was not. According to Professor Watt, Hildegard's medical writings include treatments for gynecological conditions, advice on pregnancy and childbirth, remedies for digestive disorders, techniques for treating wounds and infections, and recommendations for maintaining health through diet and lifestyle. Her pharmacopoeia describes the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants in detail that suggests real medical observation. She knows which plants reduce fever, which ones ease pain, which ones stop bleeding, which ones treat infection. This was real medical knowledge gained through experience and experimentation, but it was framed as mystical revelation to make it acceptable for a woman to possess. and share this knowledge. Think about what Hildegard's story reveals about the conditions under which women could practice medicine. You needed extraordinary protection. In Hildegard's case, the status of an abbess and the protection of a powerful monastery. You needed to frame your knowledge as coming from divine or mystical sources, rather than from your own observation and intelligence. You needed to write in Latin and use scholarly formats that gave your work legitimacy in the eyes of male authorities. And even with all of that, your work would eventually be questioned, minimized, or attributed to male collaborators, rather than being accepted as your own achievement. According to Professor Watt's research, another famous female medical practitioner was Trota of Salerno, who may or may not be the same person as the Trotula whose texts we discussed earlier, but who was definitely a real woman physician practicing in Salerno in the 11th century. Records show that Trota taught at the Salerno Medical School, that she was paid for medical consultations, that she treated both women and men, and that her medical opinions were cited by other physicians. She represents the brief period when women could practice medicine professionally in some parts of Europe, before the systematic exclusion of women from medical education and practice became total. Now, let me tell you about midwives specifically, because they were the largest group of female medical practitioners and the group most systematically targeted for elimination. According to research by Professor Leanne McTavish from the University of Alberta, whose work examines the history of midwifery, midwives in medieval and early modern Europe were essential healthcare providers who attended most births, who provided prenatal and postpartum care to women, who treated gynecological conditions, and who were the primary source of medical care for women in their communities. Professor McTavish's research reveals that midwives learned through apprenticeship, working alongside experienced midwives for years before practicing independently. They developed sophisticated knowledge of normal and complicated births. They had techniques for managing breech presentations and other problems. They understood the signs of infection and hemorrhage, and they had lower mortality rates than male physicians who attended births. This wasn't because they had better theoretical knowledge, they often couldn't read and had no access to formal education, but because they had practical experience and because they used techniques that actually worked, like hand washing, while male physicians used techniques that were often harmful, like excessive bleeding and the use of forceps. According to Professor McTavish, midwives' expertise and success made them threats to the emerging male medical profession. Male physicians wanted to take over attendance at births, not primarily to improve outcomes, but because attending births, especially births in wealthy families, was lucrative, and because controlling birth was part of controlling women. But male physicians faced a problem. They weren't as good at attending births as experienced midwives were. Their techniques, based on ancient texts rather than practical experience, often resulted in higher mortality for both mothers and babies. Their use of metal forceps caused injuries that midwives' manual techniques avoided. Their rejection of hand washing and antiseptic techniques spread infections that midwives' cleanliness prevented. The solution, according to Professor McTavish, was to discredit and eliminate midwives rather than to learn from them. Midwives were accused of being ignorant, of practicing superstition, rather than real medicine, of causing the deaths they were actually trying to prevent. They were legally prohibited from practicing in many jurisdictions, required to get licenses from male physicians, who refused to grant them, and accused of witchcraft when legal prohibitions weren't sufficient to eliminate them. The result was a deliberate transfer of birth attendance from experienced female midwives to inexperienced male physicians, and a corresponding increase in maternal and infant mortality that persisted until the 20th century, when modern obstetrics finally developed techniques as effective as traditional midwifery had been. Think about what this meant for women giving birth. In the medieval period, a woman attended by an experienced midwife had a reasonable chance of surviving childbirth and having a healthy baby. By the 18th and 19th centuries, a wealthy woman attended by a male physician in a hospital had a significant chance of dying from puerperal fever an infection spread by physicians who went from autopsy room to delivery room without washing their hands. The elimination of female midwives and the rise of male obstetrics actually made childbirth more dangerous for women, but this was framed as progress, as the triumph of scientific medicine over ignorant superstition. Let me tell you about the witch hunts themselves and how they functioned to eliminate female medical practitioners. According to research by Professor Brian Levesque from the University of Texas, whose work examines the Great Witch Hunt of early modern Europe, between approximately 1450 and 1750, somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe and colonial America, and approximately 75 to 80% of those executed were women. This wasn't coincidental. The witch hunts specifically targeted women, and they specifically targeted women who had power, knowledge, or independence that threatened male authority. Professor Levesque's research reveals that women accused of witchcraft shared certain characteristics. They were disproportionately older women, often widows who lived independently without male protection. They were disproportionately poor women who depended on community support and might make enemies by asking for help. They were disproportionately women who practiced healing, midwifery, or other skilled trades that could be reframed as witchcraft. And they were disproportionately women who were argumentative, assertive, or otherwise violated norms of female submissiveness and deference to male authority. According to Professor Levesque, the specific accusations made against alleged witches often related to healing and medicine. Women were accused of killing neighbors' children or livestock through witchcraft when actually they had attended as healers and the patient died of natural causes. They were accused of causing illness or injury when actually they had predicted illness based on symptoms they recognized, or when people fell ill after having conflicts with them. They were accused of using magical potions when actually they used herbal medicines. They were accused of having supernatural knowledge when actually they had medical expertise gained through experience. The torture and execution of women healers during the witch hunts had multiple effects, according to Professor Levesque. It eliminated many of the most knowledgeable female practitioners, breaking the chains of transmitted knowledge between generations of women. It terrorized other women into ceasing practice or hiding their knowledge for fear of being accused. It discredited female healing knowledge by associating it with witchcraft and heresy, and it cleared the way for male physicians to monopolize medical practice without competition from female practitioners who were often more skilled and experienced than they were. Think about the scale of this elimination. Imagine that over 3 centuries, tens of thousands of your most knowledgeable medical practitioners were tortured and burned alive, that the collective medical knowledge of generations of practitioners was lost, that people who might have become healers were too terrified to learn or practice, and that the surviving population was taught that the healing knowledge their grandmothers possessed was actually evil magic that came from the devil. This is what happened to female healing knowledge in early modern Europe, a systematic campaign of destruction that was one of history's great losses of medical knowledge and practice. Now, let me tell you about specific methods of healing that women practiced in secret, despite the dangers. According to research by Professor Nancy Siraisi from Hunter College, whose work examines medieval medicine, women healers had sophisticated knowledge of wound treatment that was often more effective than the treatments used by university-trained physicians. They understood that cleaning wounds reduced infection, that certain herbs had antiseptic properties, that keeping wounds closed with stitches helped them heal, and that maggots could clean infected wounds by eating dead tissue while leaving healthy tissue intact. Professor Siraisi's research reveals that female healers used honey, wine, and vinegar as antiseptics, all of which modern medicine has confirmed have genuine antibacterial properties. They made poultices from plants like comfrey and yarrow that promoted healing. They used spider webs to stop bleeding, which works because spider silk contains vitamin K and other compounds that aid clotting. They kept wounds clean and dry, while male physicians often applied filthy poultices or left wounds open to drain bad humours. The result was that wounds treated by female healers often healed better than wounds treated by male physicians. But this success made female healers suspect rather than celebrated. According to Professor Siraisi, women healers also had knowledge of bone setting that was highly effective. They knew how to align broken bones, how to immobilize them while healing, how to recognize when bones were healing incorrectly and needed to be rebroken and reset. They used splints made from wood and bark. They wrapped fractures to provide support, and they understood the importance of proper alignment for functional recovery. This was practical knowledge gained from treating many broken bones and observing what worked, and it was often superior to the bone setting attempted by male physicians who had theoretical knowledge but little practical experience. Women healers performed surgical procedures that male physicians wouldn't or couldn't do. They removed superficial tumours and cysts. They lanced abscesses and drained infections. They removed foreign objects from wounds. They repaired tears and injuries, and they performed caesarean sections on dying women to save the baby. And in rare cases, they performed successful caesarean sections that saved both mother and baby, something that male physicians insisted was impossible until the late 19th century. Let me tell you about caesarean sections specifically, because this procedure illuminates how female healers performed sophisticated surgery in secret. According to research by Professor Shelley McKellar from Western University, whose work examines the history of surgery, caesarean sections were performed by female healers in various cultures for centuries before they became accepted medical practice in Europe. Indigenous healers in Uganda and Rwanda performed caesarean sections that British colonial doctors witnessed in the 19th century and were astonished by. The healers used banana wine for antiseptic. They had developed techniques for controlling bleeding. They used iron cauterization to seal blood vessels. They successfully delivered babies and had both mother and baby survive. Professor McKellar's research reveals that European female healers almost certainly knew how to perform caesarean sections and may have performed them in secret, but couldn't publish their knowledge or teach it openly because they were excluded from medical training and practice. Male physicians insisted that caesarean sections on living women were impossible and always fatal, and the procedure wasn't accepted in European medicine until the late 19th century, when male surgeons pioneered techniques that women healers had likely been using for centuries. The first recorded successful caesarean section in Britain was in 1793. But first recorded doesn't mean first performed. It means first performed by a male surgeon who could publish his results. Think about what this reveals about the suppression of female medical knowledge. Women healers who performed surgical procedures had to work in secret. They couldn't publish their techniques or teach them in medical schools. They couldn't share their knowledge with the broader medical community. When they succeeded at procedures that male physicians insisted were impossible, their success was hidden or dismissed rather than celebrated and studied. And when male physicians finally performed the same procedures and claimed credit for pioneering them, the centuries of women's work that preceded those male firsts was erased and forgotten. According to Professor McKellar, women healers also performed abortions and infanticide, and distinguishing between these practices and their reasons is important for understanding the moral complexity of female healing. In societies where contraception was unreliable, where women had no control over when and whether they became pregnant, where an additional child could mean starvation for the whole family, and where children born outside marriage were doomed to lives of poverty and stigma, female healers provided services that women desperately needed, ways to prevent pregnancy, ways to end early pregnancies, and sometimes ways to ensure that a newborn baby didn't survive when the alternative was watching the entire family starve. Modern perspectives on abortion and infanticide are shaped by modern conditions, reliable contraception, safe pregnancy and childbirth, social support systems for mothers and children, and rights for women to make reproductive choices. But in medieval and early modern Europe, women faced different conditions. No reliable contraception, extremely dangerous pregnancy and childbirth, no social support for unmarried mothers or poor families with too many children, and no rights over their own bodies or reproductive choices. In that context, female healers who provided reproductive control were providing essential health care, and the fact that we might judge some of their practices harshly doesn't change the reality that women needed those services, and that the alternative being forced to bear children they couldn't support, or who would die anyway, was often worse. Now, let me tell you about the Malleus Maleficarum, because this text was crucial to the persecution of female healers and reveals the explicit targeting of women's medical practice. According to research by Professor Hans-Peter Braudel from the University of North Dakota, whose work examines the Malleus, this text was published in 1487 by two German Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, as a guide for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. The Malleus became the handbook for witch hunters across Europe and was directly responsible for thousands of executions. Professor Bradel's research reveals that the Malleus specifically targets female healers and midwives as likely witches. The text claims that midwives are the worst of all witches because they have access to newborn babies and can offer them to the devil, because they can cause abortions and stillbirths through witchcraft, because they can make men impotent or women sterile, and because they learn evil practices from other women and pass them down through generations. The text instructs witch hunters to pay special attention to women who practice medicine, who are especially successful at healing, who are sought out by other women, and who have knowledge of herbs and potions. According to Professor Bradell, the Malleus reveals the explicit reasoning behind targeting female healers. The text argues that women are more susceptible to the devil's influence than men, because they are more credulous, more impressionable, more carnal, and less rational. It argues that women's knowledge of medicine and herbs must come from the devil, because women are too intellectually inferior to acquire such knowledge through study and observation. It argues that successful healing by women proves witchcraft, because how else could ignorant women succeed where educated male physicians fail? Every argument the Malleus makes reveals that female healers were targeted specifically because they were female, because they were successful, because they competed with male physicians, and because they possessed knowledge that threatened male control. Think about how this reasoning worked. If your treatments failed, you were an ignorant quack practicing superstition. If your treatment succeeded, you must be using witchcraft because women couldn't possibly have real medical knowledge. Either way, you were guilty. Success was evidence of witchcraft, failure was evidence of incompetence, and there was no way to be a female healer without being vulnerable to accusations that could get you killed. The Malleus and the witch hunts it inspired created conditions where women couldn't practice medicine openly, couldn't be successful without being suspect, and couldn't pass knowledge to the next generation without risking accusation. Let me tell you about the specific torture and execution methods used against women accused of witchcraft, because understanding the brutality women faced for practicing medicine reveals the depth of the campaign against them. According to research by Professor Wolfgang Barringer from Saarland University, whose work examines witch trials in Germany, women accused of witchcraft were subjected to some of the most horrific torture methods ever devised. They were stretched on racks until joints dislocated. They were burned with hot irons. They had fingers and toes crushed in thumb screws and toe screws. They were subjected to strappado, where they were hung by their wrists tied behind their backs until shoulders dislocated. They were sleep-deprived for days. They were stripped naked and searched for devil's marks, and they were tortured until they confessed to anything their torturers wanted them to confess to. Professor Barringer's research reveals that torture was specifically designed to extract confessions that would implicate other women. Accused women were tortured until they named other witches, which led to those women being arrested and tortured until they named more women, creating cascading waves of accusations that could destroy entire communities of women. Midwives who were accused would be tortured into confessing that they killed babies and offered them to the devil. Herbalists would be tortured into confessing that their medicines were demonic potions. Healers would be tortured into confessing that their success came from the devil rather than from skill. According to Professor Beringer, after confession was extracted through torture, execution followed quickly. Burning at the stake was the most common execution method for convicted witches, though drowning, hanging, and beheading were also used. Burning was specifically chosen because it was public, spectacular, terrifying to witnesses, and because it destroyed the body completely. The belief was that witches' bodies needed to be destroyed so thoroughly that nothing remained that could be used for evil magic. Women healers who had spent their lives helping their communities, who had delivered babies and healed wounds and saved lives, were tied to stakes and burned alive while crowds watched, their medical knowledge and experience destroyed along with their bodies. Think about what witnessing these executions meant for other women. Imagine you are a woman who knows how to treat illnesses with herbs, who helps your neighbours through difficult births, who has the knowledge to help women prevent or end pregnancies. You watch another woman healer dragged to the stake, tortured into confessing impossible crimes, burned alive for doing exactly what you do. What lesson do you learn? You learn to hide your knowledge, to pretend you don't know what you know, to refuse to help even when you could because helping makes you visible, and being visible makes you vulnerable. The executions terrorized entire communities of women into silence and compliance, ensuring that knowledge would be lost and that women would submit to male medical authority. Now, let me tell you about what happened after the witch hunts, because understanding how male medicine replaced female healing reveals the lasting consequences of this suppression. According to research by Professor Roy Porter from the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine, whose work examines the history of medicine in Europe, the period after the witch hunts saw the rise of the professional male physician, the establishment of medical licensing that excluded women, the foundation of hospitals and medical schools that barred women, and the creation of medical guilds and associations that prohibited female membership. Professor Porter's research reveals that as female healers were eliminated, male physicians filled the gap, but they often provided inferior care. Male physicians in the 17th and 18th centuries relied on ancient texts rather than empirical observation. They used treatments like bloodletting and purging that often harmed patients. They refused to wash their hands because they believed gentlemen's hands couldn't transmit disease. They used metal instruments that caused injuries and infections, and they charged fees that poor patients couldn't afford, while female healers had often treated community members for free or for barter. According to Professor Porter, maternal mortality rates actually increased in the 18th and 19th centuries as male physicians took over attendance at births from female midwives. In Vienna in the 1840s, the maternal mortality rate in the hospital ward attended by male medical students was 3 times higher than the mortality rate in the ward attended by female midwives, because the medical students came to deliveries directly from dissecting cadavers without washing their hands, while the midwives maintained cleanliness. When Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis discovered this and instituted hand-washing requirements, maternal mortality dropped dramatically, but he was ridiculed by his male colleagues who refused to believe that gentlemen's hands could transmit disease, and his career was destroyed for suggesting that physicians were killing their patients. Professor Porter's research reveals that many of the advances in medicine that male physicians made in the 19th and 20th centuries were actually rediscoveries of knowledge that female healers had possessed and used for centuries. Antiseptic technique, keeping wounds clean, using substances that killed bacteria, maintaining sanitary conditions, was standard practice among female healers centuries before Lister discovered antisepsis. Anesthesia using plant-based drugs was used by female healers long before male physicians pioneered ether and chloroform. Effective treatments for pain, fever, infection, and many other conditions existed in women's traditional medicine before male pharmacology discovered the same compounds and treatments. Think about what this means for medical history. Many of the histories of medicine present developments as a straight line of progress from ignorant superstition to scientific enlightenment, from medieval darkness to modern brilliance. But the real history is more complex. There was genuine medical knowledge in traditional practice, much of it held and transmitted by women, and much of it was lost when women were eliminated from medical practice, only to be slowly and painfully rediscovered by male physicians over the following centuries. We don't know how much knowledge was permanently lost, how many effective treatments were forgotten, how many lives could have been saved if women's medical knowledge had been preserved and built upon rather than destroyed and denied. Let me tell you about some specific women healers from the early modern period whose stories we know despite the efforts to erase them. According to research by Professor Mary Lindemann from the University of Miami, whose work examines healthcare in early modern Europe, one remarkable healer was Frau Giersdorf, who practiced medicine in 17th century Germany. Frau Giersdorf was wife to a village barber surgeon and learned medicine by working alongside her husband. When he died, she continued practicing and became known throughout the region as an exceptionally skilled healer who could treat wounds, set bones, and prepare effective medicines. Professor Lindemann's research reveals that Frau Giersdorf's practice eventually attracted the attention and ire of university-trained physicians in nearby cities, who objected to a woman practicing medicine so successfully. They brought legal action to stop her from practicing, arguing that she was unlicensed, that she was practicing medicine illegally as a woman, and that she was endangering patients with her ignorant treatments. Frau Giersdorf defended herself by producing testimonials from dozens of patients she had treated successfully, including prominent citizens who swore that she had healed them when male physicians failed. She argued that she had learned her skills through long experience, that her treatments were effective, and that she served patients who couldn't afford expensive physicians. According to Professor Lindemann, the court case dragged on for years, and Frau Giersdorf was eventually forbidden from practicing surgery or prescribing internal medicines. She was restricted to treating external wounds and preparing topical salves. Even this limited practice required her to pay substantial fees for a license and to submit to supervision by male physicians. Her story illustrates how female medical practice was progressively restricted through legal mechanisms, even when execution for witchcraft was no longer common. Women who had practiced medicine for decades, who had demonstrable success, who were valued by their communities, were forbidden from practicing or had their practice so restricted and supervised that it became nearly impossible. Now let me tell you about the role of female healers in creating what we would today call public health and preventive medicine. According to research by Professor Catherine Park from Harvard University, whose work examines medieval and Renaissance medicine, women healers in communities throughout Europe provided services that went far beyond treating individual patients. They advised on hygiene and sanitation. They taught mothers how to care for infants and children. They provided nutritional guidance. They identified and quarantined contagious diseases. And they maintained community health in ways that prevented illness rather than just treating it after it occurred. Professor Park's research reveals that female healers understood contagion in practical ways long before germ theory was officially developed. They knew that some diseases spread from person to person. They isolated sick individuals to prevent spread. They cleaned and aired sick rooms. They burned contaminated materials. And they took precautions when treating contagious patients. They knew empirically that cleanliness prevented disease even though they didn't understand the mechanism. They couldn't see bacteria, but they could see that washing and maintaining clean living conditions kept people healthier than filth and crowding did. According to Professor Park, women healers also provided what we would now call mental health care. They counseled people through grief and trauma. They treated people suffering from what we would call depression and anxiety. They provided comfort and community support to people in crisis. They understood that emotional and mental states affected physical health, that isolation and despair made people sick, that connection and hope helped people heal. This holistic understanding of health, that body, mind, emotions, and social connections all matter, was part of traditional female healing practice, and it was lost when medicine became professionalized and focused exclusively on physical disease and pathology. Think about what was lost when female healers were eliminated from practice. Not just specific medical techniques and herbal remedies, but an entire approach to healthcare community-based, rather than professionalized, focused on prevention as well as treatment, attentive to social and emotional dimensions of health, accessible to poor patients as well as rich. The male medical profession that replaced female healers provided none of these things. It was expensive. It focused on treating disease rather than preventing it. It ignored social determinants of health, and it was inaccessible to most of the population. The elimination of female healers didn't just change who provided healthcare. It fundamentally changed what healthcare was and who had access to it. Let me tell you about female healers in colonial America, because their experiences show that the persecution of women healers wasn't limited to Europe, and that it continued into later periods. According to research by Professor Carol Carlson from the University of Michigan, whose work examines witchcraft accusations in colonial New England, women healers in American colonies faced the same dangers as their European counterparts: accusations of witchcraft, legal restrictions on practice, and systematic efforts to eliminate them in favor of male physicians. Professor Carlson's research reveals that the Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693, the most famous witch hunt in American history, targeted several women who were healers or midwives. Bridget Bishop, the first person executed in the Salem trials, was accused of using witchcraft to kill people, but the actual evidence was that she had treated sick people and some of them died, which in an era of limited medical knowledge was inevitable. Rebecca Nurse, an elderly woman executed in Salem, was accused of using witchcraft to harm children. But she was actually a healer and midwife who had attended difficult births and treated sick children, some of whom died despite her care. The accusations against these women used their medical practice as evidence of witchcraft, just as accusations in Europe had done. According to Professor Carlson, even after witch trials ended in colonial America, women healers continued to face legal restrictions and professional opposition. Male physicians in colonial cities organized to prohibit women from practicing medicine. They lobbied for licensing laws that excluded women. They spread propaganda claiming that female healers were ignorant and dangerous. And they worked systematically to eliminate competition from women who were often more experienced and skilled than they were. Professor Carlson's research reveals one particularly telling case from 18th century New York. A woman healer successfully treated a difficult case of infection that male physicians had failed to cure. The patient recovered completely and publicly credited the woman healer. Rather than celebrating this success, the male physicians brought legal action against the woman for practicing medicine without a license that they themselves controlled and refused to grant to women. The woman argued that she had saved a life that the male physicians were unable to save, but she was fined and forbidden from practicing. Success was evidence of dangerous competence that threatened male medical monopoly. Think about what this reveals about the real reasons female healers were suppressed. If the concern had truly been about patient safety and medical competence, then women who demonstrated success would have been welcomed and encouraged. But that is not what happened. Successful female healers were targeted for elimination precisely because they succeeded, because they competed effectively with male physicians, because patients preferred them and sought their help. The suppression of female healers was never about protecting patients. It was about protecting male professional and economic interests. Now, let me tell you about efforts to recover and preserve women's traditional medical knowledge before it was completely lost. According to research by Professor Rebecca Tannenbaum from Trinity University, whose work examines women's medical practice in early America, some women tried to preserve their knowledge by writing it down in recipe books and household manuals that documented medical treatments alongside cooking recipes and household advice. These books were passed from mother to daughter, and documented centuries of accumulated medical knowledge in formats that didn't look threatening or professional. Professor Tannenbaum's research reveals that these household medical books contain sophisticated treatments for a wide range of conditions. Recipes for wound salves that contain herbs with genuine antimicrobial properties, techniques for setting bones and treating sprains, remedies for digestive problems and fevers, treatments for skin conditions and infections, and advice on childbirth and infant care. The knowledge documented in these books represents the accumulated experience of generations of women healers, and it is often more practical and effective than the treatments recommended by male physicians of the same period. According to Professor Tannenbaum, these household medical books had to be carefully worded to avoid accusations of witchcraft or illegal medical practice. Women who wrote down their medical knowledge framed it as household management rather than medical practice. They attributed recipes to family tradition rather than to medical expertise. They avoided claiming specialized knowledge or positioning themselves as healers. Even in private books meant only for family use, women had to hide the extent of their medical knowledge for fear of being accused if the books were ever seen by hostile eyes. Professor Tannenbaum discusses one particularly revealing example, a household book from 17th century England that contains over 200 medical recipes alongside cooking and household management advice. The medical recipes are sophisticated. They recommend specific plants for specific conditions based on clear understanding of their effects. They provide dosing information that shows understanding of how to balance efficacy with safety, and they include observational notes about which treatments work best for which patients. But this sophisticated medical knowledge is embedded in a format that looks like ordinary household management, making it less threatening and less likely to attract accusation. Think about what this strategy reveals about the conditions women faced. They had to hide their knowledge in plain sight, disguising medical expertise as household skills, framing healing as wifely duty rather than professional practice. They couldn't claim credit for their knowledge or acknowledge their skill, because doing so would make them vulnerable. Even in private books not meant for publication, they had to be careful, protective, aware that their knowledge was dangerous. This is what systemic oppression looks like, not just overt violence and execution, but the requirement that people hide their capabilities, minimize their skills, pretend to be less knowledgeable than they are for their own safety. Let me tell you about the long-term consequences of eliminating female healers and female medical knowledge. According to research by Professor Mary Fissell from Johns Hopkins University, whose work examines the social history of medicine, the professionalization of medicine, and the exclusion of women, had effects that persisted into the 20th century and continue to affect healthcare today. When medicine became exclusively male, it lost the knowledge and perspectives that women healers had brought to practice. When hospitals and medical schools excluded women, they eliminated half the potential talent pool and prevented women from contributing to medical advancement. When medical practice became expensive and fee-based rather than community-based and accessible, large portions of the population lost access to healthcare. Professor Fissell's research reveals that women didn't gain re-entry to medical practice easily or quickly. The first medical schools that admitted women in the 19th century faced enormous opposition from male physicians and medical associations. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States in 1849, was admitted to Geneva Medical College only because the male students voted to admit her as a joke. They thought the application from a woman must be a prank, and they voted yes, thinking it was funny. When Elizabeth actually showed up and turned out to be serious about studying medicine, the faculty and students were horrified. She faced constant harassment, discrimination, and attempts to force her to quit, but she persisted and graduated first in her class. According to Professor Fissell, Elizabeth Blackwell's story illustrates what women who wanted to practice medicine faced even after the witch-burning era had ended. They had to be exceptional just to be allowed to try. They had to endure harassment and discrimination that would have broken most people. They had to be better than their male counterparts just to be considered equal. and even when they succeeded, their achievements were minimized and dismissed. Elizabeth Blackwell graduated top of her class from medical school, but she couldn't get a job in any hospital or join any medical practice because no male physician would work with a woman. She had to establish her own practice and eventually founded her own hospital, the New York Infirmary for Women and Children, staffed entirely by women physicians because male physicians refused to work alongside women. Think about what this means. Even after the witch hunts ended, even after women couldn't be legally burned for practicing medicine, the systematic exclusion continued through different mechanisms. If you couldn't be killed for healing, you could be denied education. If you managed to get educated, you could be denied employment. If you established your own practice, you could be denied hospital privileges, membership in professional societies, and access to medical journals and continuing education. The goal remained the same: to keep women out of medicine and to maintain male monopoly on medical practice and medical knowledge. Professor Fissel's research reveals that women's exclusion from medicine had measurable effects on medical outcomes. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, women who had access to female physicians had better health outcomes than women who could only access male physicians, particularly for reproductive health conditions. Women were more likely to seek medical care for gynecological problems from female physicians. Female physicians were more likely to listen to women's symptoms and concerns, and female physicians had lower mortality rates for childbirth and gynecological surgery than male physicians who had less experience with women's bodies and less willingness to learn from their patients' experiences. Now let me tell you about specific dangerous procedures that women healers performed in secret that saved lives but could have gotten them killed. According to research by Professor Gianna Pomata from Bologna University, whose work examines women's medical practice in Renaissance Italy, women surgeons performed procedures that male physicians wouldn't or couldn't do, often with better outcomes than male practitioners achieved. These weren't simple procedures. They were complex surgeries that required skill, knowledge, and courage. Professor Pomata's research reveals that women surgeons removed bladder stones, a painful and life-threatening condition that was common before modern surgery. The procedure, called lithotomy, involved making an incision in the perineum and extracting the stone from the bladder. It was extremely painful, dangerous, and required precise anatomical knowledge to avoid causing fatal damage. Male surgeons who performed lithotomy had high mortality rates. Patients often died from surgical shock, bleeding, or infection. But according to records Professor Pomata examined, some women healers performed lithotomy with lower mortality rates because they used pain management techniques that male surgeons disdained because they maintained cleaner surgical conditions, and because they had developed techniques through practice that were more effective than the methods taught in medical schools. According to Professor Pomata, women surgeons also removed cataracts, a procedure that required incredible precision and steady hands. The surgery involved using a needle to push the clouded lens out of the line of sight, partially restoring vision. If done incorrectly, the patient could be left completely blind or could develop infections that led to loss of the eye. Women surgeons who specialized in cataract surgery traveled from town to town offering their services, and many had reputations for exceptional success rates. But they had to work in secret or under male supervision, because performing surgery as an independent woman practitioner was illegal in most jurisdictions. Women surgeons performed amputations, removed tumors, repaired hernias, drained abscesses, and performed other surgical procedures that required anatomical knowledge and surgical skill. According to Professor Pomata, they often learned their craft through apprenticeship with other female surgeons, creating chains of knowledge transmission that were entirely outside the male medical establishment. When these women were successful, they attracted patients and made male surgeons look incompetent by comparison. When they were caught practicing without licenses that they couldn't legally obtain, they were prosecuted, fined, and forbidden from practicing. and in some cases they were accused of witchcraft and executed. Think about the courage it took to perform surgery in these conditions. You are operating on someone, possibly causing them severe pain, despite your best efforts at pain management, possibly seeing them die despite your best efforts to save them. And you know that if someone accuses you of witchcraft or illegal practice, the patient you just saved could become evidence against you in your trial. You know that your success makes you more vulnerable rather than less, that the more effectively you heal, the more dangerous your position becomes. And yet women continued to practice, continued to heal, continued to take these risks, because people needed help and because they had knowledge and skills that could save lives. Let me tell you about women healers' knowledge of mental health and psychological conditions, because this was another area where women's expertise was systematically suppressed and devalued. According to research by Professor Andrew Scull from UC San Diego, whose work examines the history of psychiatry, women healers traditionally provided care for people suffering from what we would now call mental illness, depression, anxiety, psychosis, dementia, and other conditions that affected mental and emotional functioning. They used combinations of practical care, herbal remedies, spiritual counsel, and community support to help people manage their conditions and maintain functioning. Professor Scull's research reveals that women healers understood mental and emotional conditions as having multiple causes: physical illness, trauma, social isolation, grief, spiritual crisis, and they treated the whole person rather than just trying to eliminate symptoms. They knew which herbs helped with anxiety and sleeplessness, which ones helped with depression and melancholy, which ones calmed agitation and reduced hallucinations. They provided practical support, helping families care for mentally ill members, teaching techniques for managing difficult behaviors, creating community connections that reduced isolation, and they provided emotional and spiritual support, counseling people through crisis, helping them find meaning in suffering, connecting them with spiritual resources. According to Professor Scull, when medicine professionalized and psychiatry emerged as a medical specialty in the 18th and 19th centuries, this holistic approach to mental health was abandoned. Mental illness became a brain disease to be treated with physical interventions, bleeding, purging, restraints, cold water shocks, and later lobotomies and electroshock therapy. The emotional, social, and spiritual dimensions of mental health were ignored. Patients were institutionalized in asylums where they were often treated brutally and where recovery rates were abysmal. The practical wisdom that women healers had accumulated about supporting people with mental illness in their communities was lost, dismissed as ignorant superstition. Professor Scull's research reveals that many women who were institutionalized as mentally ill were actually women who had been healers, mystics, or otherwise deviant from social norms. Women who heard voices or had visions, experiences that might have made them powerful healers or spiritual leaders in earlier eras or different cultures, were diagnosed as insane and locked away. Women who refused to conform to feminine norms, who were too assertive or sexual or independent, were diagnosed with hysteria and subjected to brutal treatments designed to make them compliant. Women healers who practiced medicine were accused of being delusional about their abilities, and their medical knowledge was reframed as evidence of mental illness rather than of genuine expertise. Think about this additional layer of persecution. Not only could practicing medicine get you accused of witchcraft, but even claiming to have medical knowledge could get you diagnosed as insane. Women who insisted they knew how to heal, who believed in their own expertise, who wouldn't accept male physicians' assertions that they were ignorant, could be declared mad and institutionalized. Your confidence in your own knowledge and abilities became evidence of delusion. Your insistence on your own reality became evidence of insanity, and you could lose your freedom and be subjected to brutal treatment for refusing to accept that men knew better than you did about your own skills and experience. Now, let me tell you about indigenous women healers in colonized regions, because the suppression of female healing knowledge was part of colonial projects worldwide. not just a European phenomenon. According to research by Professor Margarita Archwager Kay from the University of Arizona, whose work examines traditional medicine in indigenous communities, colonizers systematically targeted indigenous women healers as part of efforts to destroy indigenous cultures and establish European Christian dominance. Indigenous women who were respected healers, spiritual leaders, and knowledge keepers in their communities were accused of witchcraft, were forbidden from practicing traditional medicine, and were forced to abandon their healing work or face severe punishment. Professor Kay's research reveals that indigenous women healers in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania possessed sophisticated medical knowledge specific to their environments. They knew which local plants had medicinal properties. They had developed effective treatments for local diseases. They had surgical techniques adapted to the tools and materials available to them. And they had accumulated centuries or millennia of observational knowledge about what worked for their populations in their environments. This knowledge was typically passed from mother to daughter, or from experienced healer to apprentice, creating long chains of knowledge transmission that preserved and refined medical understanding across generations. According to Professor Kay, colonial authorities targeted this knowledge in multiple ways. Christian missionaries declared indigenous healing practices to be demonic witchcraft and forbade converts from practicing or seeking traditional healing. Colonial governments made traditional medicine illegal and punished practitioners. Colonial doctors and anthropologists sometimes extracted knowledge from indigenous healers, learning their techniques and remedies, and then claimed credit for discovering these treatments while simultaneously working to eliminate the indigenous practitioners who had taught them. And colonial schools removed indigenous children from their communities and forbade them from learning traditional knowledge, breaking the chains of transmission. Professor Kay's research reveals specific examples of the sophistication of indigenous women healers' knowledge. Indigenous women in the Amazon rainforest had catalogued hundreds of medicinal plants and understood their specific effects, dosing, and preparation methods, knowledge that modern pharmacology is still working to document and understand. Indigenous women in sub-Saharan Africa developed cesarean section techniques that successfully saved both mothers and babies centuries before European medicine accepted that such surgery was possible. Indigenous women in North America had effective treatments for scurvy, infections, and other conditions that European colonists suffered and died from because they refused to learn from indigenous healers who could have saved them. Think about what this colonial suppression of indigenous women's healing knowledge meant. Entire populations lost access to medical knowledge that had been developed over thousands of years and specifically adapted to their environments and their bodies. People died from diseases that indigenous healers could have treated effectively. Children grew up without learning the knowledge their ancestors had accumulated, and the colonizers who destroyed this knowledge often died themselves from conditions that the healers they had eliminated could have cured, because their arrogance and racism prevented them from learning from people they considered inferior. According to Professor Kay, indigenous women healers who continued practicing in secret faced severe dangers. If they were caught, they could be imprisoned, beaten, have their children taken away, or be killed. But many continued practicing because their communities needed them, because Western medicine was inaccessible or ineffective for their populations, and because they understood that if they didn't pass their knowledge on, it would be lost forever. These women were performing dangerous healings in secret, not just because the practices themselves were dangerous, but because the act of healing while indigenous and female was declared criminal by colonial powers. Let me tell you about women healers during plagues and epidemics, because understanding how women provided care during the deadliest disease outbreaks reveals both their courage and the dangers they faced. According to research by Professor Samuel Cohn from the University of Glasgow, whose work examines plague and epidemic disease in medieval and early modern Europe, women were disproportionately represented among caregivers during plague outbreaks, and they faced both the physical danger of infection and the social danger of being blamed for the disease. Professor Cohn's research reveals that during the Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks in the 14th through 17th centuries, women healers continued to care for sick patients even when male physicians fled. Records show that male physicians often abandoned cities when plague arrived, returning only after the outbreak had ended, while female healers remained and continued treating patients. Despite the enormous risk, these women used whatever techniques they knew to try to help. They cleaned and cared for patients. They used herbal remedies to reduce fever and pain. They comforted the dying, and they helped communities dispose of bodies and prevent further spread. According to Professor Cohn, women healers during plague outbreaks were often accused of causing the disease rather than being recognized for their courage in fighting it. When people observed that plague deaths seemed to increase in households where certain women provided care, they concluded that those women must be spreading the plague through witchcraft, rather than understanding that those women were simply seeing more patients because they were the only ones willing to provide care. Women healers were accused of poisoning wells, of spreading plague through evil potions, of causing illness through curses and spells, when actually they were risking their own lives to help sick people that no one else would approach. Professor Cohn's research reveals specific cases of women healers who were accused and executed during plague outbreaks. In several German and Italian cities during 14th and 15th century plague epidemics, women who were known healers were arrested on charges of plague, spreading, tortured into confessing, and executed publicly as scapegoats for the disease. Their executions didn't stop the plague, of course they didn't, because these women weren't causing the disease, they were fighting it. But the executions provided communities with someone to blame and punished women who had been too visible, too successful, or too independent in their healing practices. Think about the horrible choice these women faced. If you fled plague outbreaks like male physicians did, people in your community would die without care, but you would be relatively safe from both disease and accusation. If you stayed and provided care, you would almost certainly be exposed to plague and might die from it. And you also risked being accused of causing the disease and being executed for it. These women chose to stay and help despite both dangers, and many of them died, either from the disease they were treating or from execution for allegedly causing it. Their courage and sacrifice were repaid with suspicion, accusation, and violence. Now let me tell you about women healers' knowledge of nutrition and how diet affects health, because this was another area where women's traditional knowledge was sophisticated and effective, but was suppressed and devalued. According to research by Professor Bridget Ann Hennish from the University of Maryland, whose work examines food and health in medieval Europe, women healers understood the connections between diet and health long before medical nutrition became an official field of study. They knew which foods helped recovery from illness, which ones provided strength for pregnant and nursing women, which ones helped children grow, which ones were suitable for the elderly and infirm. Professor Hinnish's research reveals that women healers used food as medicine in sophisticated ways. They made bone broths that we now know contain minerals and compounds that support healing. They gave herbal teas that provided vitamins and minerals lacking in limited winter diets. They knew that certain foods needed to be cooked to be digestible and safe, while others lost nutrients with cooking. They preserved foods in ways that maintained nutritional value, fermenting, drying, storing in honey or salt. They managed household food resources to ensure that pregnant women, nursing mothers, growing children, and sick family members got the most nutritious foods, even when overall food was scarce. According to Professor Hinnish, this nutritional knowledge was part of women's household management and healing practice, but it was dismissed by male physicians who relied on humoral theory, the idea that health was about balancing hot, cold, wet, and dry qualities rather than about nutrition in the sense we understand it. Male physicians prescribed diets based on theoretical humoral qualities of foods, rather than on empirical observation of which diets actually kept people healthy, and their dietary recommendations were often actively harmful. Women healers' practical knowledge of nutrition worked better than physicians' theoretical knowledge. But this success was attributed to luck or to women's natural domestic skills, rather than to medical expertise. Professor Henish's research reveals that women healers understood connections between diet and specific conditions that medicine didn't officially recognize for centuries. They knew that citrus fruits and fresh vegetables prevented scurvy. They knew that liver was good for people who were weak and pale, anemic. They knew that whole grains were more nourishing than refined flour. They knew that children needed milk and meat to grow strong. This was empirical knowledge gained from observing what worked, and it was more accurate than the dietary theories taught in medical schools. But it was women's knowledge, and therefore considered inferior to men's theoretical knowledge. Think about how much unnecessary suffering resulted from dismissing women's nutritional knowledge. Sailors died from scurvy for centuries before the British Navy officially accepted that citrus fruits prevented it. But women in sailing communities had known this and had tried to tell ship surgeons, only to be dismissed as ignorant. Children suffered from rickets and other nutritional deficiencies while male physicians prescribed medicines and treatments, when female healers knew that the children needed better food, sunshine, and fresh air. Pregnant women suffered complications that proper nutrition could have prevented, while male physicians prescribed bed rest and bloodletting instead of the nourishing foods that midwives knew were needed. Let me tell you about women healers in religious orders and how they used religious authority to protect their medical practice. According to research by Professor Sharon Struckia from Emory University, whose work examines women's religious communities in Renaissance Italy, convents and women's religious houses served as medical centers where women could practice healing under the protection of religious authority. Nuns operated hospitals, hospices, and pharmacies where they provided medical care to their communities, and their religious status gave them legitimacy and protection that lay women healers lack. Professor Struckia's research reveals that religious women healers were sophisticated medical practitioners. They operated infirmaries within convents that cared for sick nuns. They ran hospitals that served their broader communities. They compounded medicines in convent pharmacies, and they wrote medical texts documenting their knowledge and practices. Some convents specialized in particular types of care, caring for orphans and abandoned children, providing hospice care for the dying, treating particular diseases, or specializing in pharmaceutical preparation. These religious medical institutions were often more effective and more trusted than male physicians' practices, because the nuns were experienced, because they provided care motivated by religious charity rather than profit, and because they were women caring for women in contexts where women felt safe. According to Professor Struckia, religious women's medical practice faced some of the same restrictions as lay women's practice, but in milder forms. Church authorities periodically worried about nuns knowing too much about medicine and tried to restrict their practice or place it under male supervision, but these restrictions were hard to enforce and were often ignored. Nuns' medical work was framed as religious charity and as extension of women's natural caregiving role, making it more acceptable than lay women's professional medical practice would have been, and convents had some autonomy and institutional protection that individual women lacked, making it harder for authorities to simply shut down their medical work. Professor Struckia's research reveals specific examples of famous women's medical religious houses. The Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, founded and run by women's religious orders, cared for abandoned children and became known throughout Italy for its successful child-rearing practices and low mortality rates. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, operated by nuns, was one of Europe's largest and most important hospitals for centuries. Convent pharmacies throughout Europe produced high-quality medicines that were sought after by wealthy patrons. These were not marginal institutions. They were central to healthcare in their regions, and they were run by women using knowledge and skills that women had accumulated and transmitted over generations. Think about what religious women's medical practice reveals about the conditions necessary for women to practice healing. You needed institutional protection, in this case the authority and autonomy of religious orders. You needed to frame your practice in terms that made it acceptable, religious charity, rather than professional expertise. You needed to work within women's spaces where male supervision was less constant. And even with all of that, you were still vulnerable to restrictions and supervision that male practitioners didn't face. Religious women had more freedom to practice medicine than lay women did, but they still operated within a system designed to limit women's medical authority and to keep ultimate control in male hands. Now, let me tell you about the women who did manage to practice medicine openly in later periods, and the obstacles they faced that reveal the persistence of bias against female healers. According to research by Professor Regina Marantz Sanchez from the University of Michigan, whose work examines women physicians in 19th and early 20th century America, women who graduated from medical schools and attempted to practice medicine faced systematic discrimination that prevented many of them from using their training effectively. They were denied hospital privileges, excluded from medical societies, refused partnerships in established practices, and subjected to harassment and ridicule from male colleagues and patients. Professor Marantz Sanchez's research reveals that women physicians had to create their own institutions in order to practice. They founded women's hospitals where they could admit patients and perform surgery. They established women's medical schools to train more women physicians. They created women's medical journals to publish their research. And they formed women's medical societies for professional support and networking. These separate institutions were necessary because existing medical institutions excluded women, but they also relegated women to second-class status in medicine. Women's hospitals were smaller and less prestigious than mainstream hospitals. Women's medical schools were seen as inferior to men's schools. Women's journals were less influential than mainstream medical journals. According to Professor Marantz Sanchez, women physicians also faced a double bind regarding their areas of practice. If they specialized in women's health and children's health, they were accused of having limited skills and of being unable to handle real medicine. If they practiced general medicine or surgery, they were accused of being unwomanly, of abandoning their natural feminine sphere, and of being ill-suited to treat male patients. They couldn't win. Whatever they chose to do was used as evidence that women shouldn't be physicians. Professor Marantz Sanchez's research reveals that despite all these obstacles, women physicians often achieved better outcomes than male physicians, particularly in areas involving women's and children's health. Women physicians had lower surgical mortality rates, lower rates of infection, and higher patient satisfaction than male physicians in the same specialties. But these successes were attributed to various factors other than women's medical skill. Maybe women were just naturally more careful. Maybe they got easier cases. Maybe they were better at comforting patients, even if they weren't as medically skilled. Women's successes couldn't be acknowledged as evidence of medical competence without undermining the entire justification for excluding women from medicine. Think about how the mechanisms of exclusion adapted over time. When women could be killed for practicing medicine, that was the method used. When execution became unacceptable, legal exclusion and professional restrictions were used instead. When women managed to get medical education and licenses, informal discrimination and separate institutions relegated them to secondary status. The specific tactics changed, but the goal remained constant: to keep medicine primarily male, to maintain men's control over medical knowledge and practice, and to prevent women from achieving equality in medical authority and recognition. Let me tell you about what modern research has revealed about the effectiveness of traditional healing practices that women healers used. Because modern science has vindicated many of the treatments that were dismissed as ignorant superstition. According to research by Professor David Newman from Columbia University Medical Center, whose work examines natural products in drug development, approximately 40% of modern pharmaceuticals are derived from or inspired by natural products that were used in traditional medicine, many of them by female herbalists and traditional healers who were dismissed and persecuted for their practice. Professor Newman's research reveals that women healers' use of willow bark for pain and fever was based on real medicinal compounds, salicin, which led to the development of aspirin. Their use of foxglove for heart conditions was based on digitalis compounds still used in cardiac medicine today. Their use of cinchona bark for fevers was based on quinine, which revolutionized malaria treatment. Their use of opium poppies for pain management was based on morphine and other opioids still central to pain medicine. Their use of herbs like valerian, chamomile, and passionflower for anxiety and sleep was based on genuine sedative and anxiolytic compounds that modern research has confirmed. According to Professor Newman, women healers were conducting empirical medical research through their practice. They observed which treatments worked, refined their techniques based on outcomes, shared knowledge with other practitioners, and accumulated effective therapies over generations. This was real medicine based on real observation, but because it was practiced by women, because it wasn't conducted in universities or published in medical journals, because it didn't use the language and frameworks of academic medicine, it was dismissed as superstition. Only when male scientists discovered the same compounds and effects were they recognized as real medicine worthy of study and respect. Professor Newman's research also reveals that some traditional healing practices that were dismissed as pure superstition turn out to have mechanisms of action that modern science is only beginning to understand. The use of honey on wounds, which women healers practiced for centuries, has been confirmed to have antibacterial properties and to promote healing. The use of maggots to clean infected wounds, which sounds horrible, but which some traditional healers used, actually works because the maggots eat dead tissue while leaving healthy tissue intact. The use of certain molds and fermented substances which looked like using rotten material to treat patients was actually early antibiotic therapy, because some molds produce substances that kill bacteria. Think about what this scientific vindication means. Women healers were right about many of their treatments. Their empirical knowledge was real medical knowledge. Their success wasn't luck or placebo effect or demonic assistance. It was based on genuine therapeutic effects of the substances and techniques they used. They were killed, silenced, and erased for possessing and practicing knowledge that turned out to be medically valid. If their knowledge had been respected and preserved instead of suppressed and destroyed, if they had been allowed to participate in developing medical science, instead of being excluded from it, medical progress might have advanced much more quickly, and many lives might have been saved. As we come to the end of this journey through the dangerous history of women's healing, you might reflect on what these stories reveal about knowledge, power, and the costs of suppressing expertise. You've discovered tonight that women healers possessed real medical knowledge that was effective and valuable, that they practiced sophisticated medicine under conditions of extreme danger, that they were systematically eliminated, not because they were incompetent, but because they were successful and therefore threatening to male power and male economic interests, and that the suppression of female healing knowledge was one of history's great losses, a loss of accumulated wisdom, of effective practices, of lives that could have been saved. You've learned about the witch hunts that targeted women healers specifically, about the torture and execution of women whose crime was knowing how to heal, about the mechanisms of exclusion that prevented women from practicing medicine even after execution was no longer used, and about the long struggle to regain access to medicine that women are still fighting today. You've learned that women healers knew about antiseptic technique, anesthesia, effective herbal medicine, surgical procedures, nutrition, mental health, and public health centuries before these became official parts of medical knowledge. You've learned that their empirical knowledge was often more effective than the theoretical knowledge of university-trained male physicians, and that the replacement of female community Based healing with male professionalized medicine actually made healthcare worse for many people before it eventually got better. You've also learned about the courage and persistence of women healers who continued practicing despite the dangers, who preserved their knowledge in secret, who passed their wisdom to daughters and apprentices, who founded their own medical institutions when they were excluded from men's institutions, and who fought their way back into medicine despite centuries of exclusion and suppression. You've learned that indigenous women healers around the world faced similar suppression as part of colonial projects, and that the effects of this suppression persist in communities that lost their traditional medical knowledge. And you've learned that modern science has vindicated many traditional healing practices that women were killed for using, confirming that they possessed real medical knowledge that deserved to be respected rather than destroyed. Thank you for spending this time learning about women who performed dangerous healings in secret throughout history. You now understand that when we talk about dangerous healings, we mean both that the practices themselves were sometimes risky, and that practicing healing as a woman was dangerous. It could get you accused of witchcraft, executed, legally prohibited from practice, excluded from medical education, relegated to second-class status, or erased from history. You understand that the danger came not from the healing itself, but from systems of power that couldn't tolerate women having knowledge, expertise, and authority in domains that men wanted to monopolize. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to remember these women healers and the knowledge they preserved. Remember Agnes Bernauer, who was drowned for being a healer and marrying above her station. Remember Hildegard of Bingen, who had to frame her medical knowledge as divine visions to make it acceptable. Remember the midwives who had lower mortality rates than male physicians, but who were eliminated through witch hunts and legal exclusion. Remember Frau Giersdorf, who successfully treated patients male physicians couldn't help and was prohibited from practicing anyway. Remember Elizabeth Blackwell, who became a physician despite facing constant harassment and discrimination. Remember all the unnamed women healers who delivered babies, treated wounds, created medicines, performed surgeries, cared for plague victims, and provided healthcare to their communities, despite knowing that their work put them in danger. Remember that women's medical knowledge was real, valuable, and effective, and that it was suppressed, not because it didn't work, but because it did work, not because women were incompetent, but because they were competent, and therefore threatening. Remember that much of what male physicians pioneered in the 19th and 20th centuries had been practiced by female healers for centuries earlier, and that we'll never know how much knowledge was permanently lost when women healers were eliminated, and their wisdom was not preserved or transmitted to the next generation. The next time you seek medical care, I want you to remember this history. Remember that it wasn't until relatively recently that women could become physicians legally and openly, that women's access to medical education and practice is a hard-won achievement that was fought for over centuries, and that the medical profession still struggles with gender bias, discrimination, and unequal treatment of women physicians and women patients. Remember that much of the knowledge about women's health that we have today was preserved and transmitted by women healers, despite all efforts to suppress it, and that we owe an enormous debt to the women who kept that knowledge alive through the centuries, when practicing medicine as a woman could get you killed. If you are a woman, you might think about the women in your family history who knew how to heal, who attended births, who treated illnesses with herbs and home remedies, who preserved medical knowledge in household books and oral traditions. You might think about what knowledge was lost between their generation and yours, what wisdom died with grandmothers who couldn't pass it on because times had changed, and that knowledge was no longer valued. You might think about what it means that until very recently in human history, if you wanted to be a healer, you had to practice in secret, hide your knowledge, risk your life, and deny your own expertise to survive. If you are someone who provides healthcare today, you might think about the legacy of suppression and exclusion you've inherited. You might think about the knowledge that was lost, and how modern medicine might be different if women's healing traditions had been preserved, and integrated rather than destroyed and replaced. You might think about how gender bias persists in medicine, how women's symptoms are taken less seriously than men's, how women physicians still face discrimination and harassment, how medical research has historically focused on male bodies and male experiences and treated women as variations or afterthoughts. You might think about what it would mean to honor the tradition of female healing in your own practice, to recognize that caregiving, holistic treatment, community-based care, and attention to emotional and social dimensions of health were always part of medicine until they were stripped away to professionalize practice. As you prepare for sleep, I want you to think about what these stories reveal about knowledge and power. Knowledge becomes dangerous when the people who possess it are seen as threatening by those who want to monopolize it. Women healers were dangerous, not because their healing practices were harmful. Many of their practices were more effective than what male physicians offered, but because their existence challenged male authority and male monopoly on medicine. The danger came from challenging power, not from the healing itself. Think about how this pattern repeats throughout history. People who possess knowledge that threatens established power structures are accused, suppressed, eliminated, and their knowledge is either stolen and credited to others or is destroyed and lost. This happened to women healers, but it has also happened to indigenous people whose knowledge was extracted by colonizers, to enslaved people whose innovations were claimed by enslavers, to working class people whose experiential knowledge was dismissed by educated elites, and to many others whose expertise was denied because of who they were, rather than because their knowledge was invalid. As you begin to drift into sleep, let go of the specific details and just hold on to the essence of what you've learned tonight. Women healers throughout history possessed real medical knowledge, practiced effective healing, and faced extreme danger for doing so. They were courageous, skilled, knowledgeable, and resilient. They preserved wisdom across generations despite enormous obstacles. They saved lives, eased suffering, and provided care when no one else would. They deserved to be honored and celebrated, not persecuted and killed. And their legacy lives on in every woman who provides healthcare today, in every person who values traditional healing knowledge, and in every effort to make medicine more inclusive, equitable, and responsive to all people's needs. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with a deeper appreciation for the women healers who came before us, who preserved medical knowledge through the darkest times, who risked everything to help others, and whose courage and skill gave us the medical understanding we inherit today. May you remember that knowledge is never really lost as long as someone values it and works to preserve it, that truth eventually emerges even when it has been suppressed for centuries, and that the women who practiced dangerous healings in secret throughout history were not witches or charlatans, but were skilled practitioners whose work deserves to be remembered, studied, and honored. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with images of women healing each other, passing knowledge from generation to generation, courageously practicing their craft despite danger, and slowly, painfully, fighting their way back into recognition and respect. May you remember that every woman who provides healthcare today, every woman who studies medicine, every woman who preserves traditional healing knowledge, stands on the shoulders of countless women who came before, who faced persecution and suppression, but who refused to let their knowledge die. Sleep well, knowing that the dangerous healings women performed in secret throughout history were acts of courage, compassion, and resistance, and that their legacy continues in the ongoing work of making healthcare accessible, equitable, and responsive to all people's needs. Before you drift completely into sleep, I want to leave you with one more set of stories about women healers who have been forgotten, but whose contributions shaped medicine in ways we still benefit from today. These are women whose names you might never have heard, whose work was stolen or minimized, but whose courage and skill deserve to be remembered as you rest tonight. Let me tell you about Mary C. Cole, because her story shows how women healers of color faced double discrimination, and how they persisted anyway. According to research by Professor Jane Robinson from the University of Leeds, whose work examines Mary Seacole's life and medical practice, Mary was a Jamaican-Scottish woman, born in 1805, who learned traditional Caribbean healing practices from her mother, a doctoress who ran a boarding house in Kingston, Jamaica. Mary combined this traditional knowledge with observation of British military medicine and developed sophisticated techniques for treating tropical diseases, cholera, yellow fever, and war wounds. Professor Robinson's research reveals that during the Crimean War in the 1850s, Mary Seacole wanted to volunteer as a nurse to help wounded soldiers, just as Florence Nightingale was doing. But when Mary applied to join Nightingale's nursing corps, she was rejected, most likely because of racial prejudice, though the official reasons given were vague. Undeterred, Mary used her own money to travel to Crimea independently, and she established what she called the British Hotel, actually a combination of hospital, convalescent home, and store where she treated wounded soldiers using her medical knowledge and provided supplies and comfort to troops. According to Professor Robinson, Mary Seacole was remarkably effective. She treated cholera successfully using techniques she had developed in Jamaica that were more effective than the treatments British military doctors used. She went onto battlefields under fire to treat wounded soldiers, risking her life to provide care. She performed surgeries and treated infections using herbal remedies and techniques that combined Caribbean traditional medicine with practical battlefield experience. Soldiers wrote about her with gratitude and affection, calling her Mother Seacole and crediting her with saving their lives when military doctors had given up on them. Think about what Mary Seacole achieved, despite facing both gender and racial discrimination. She was excluded from official nursing service because of who she was, not because she lacked skill. In fact, her skill exceeded that of many of the military doctors and nurses who were officially sanctioned. She had to fund her own medical work when male doctors and white nurses received government support. She worked under battlefield conditions where she risked her life to help others, and she did all of this while knowing that her contributions would likely be minimized or forgotten, while less skilled but more socially acceptable practitioners would be celebrated and remembered. Professor Robinson's research reveals that after the war, Mary Seacole returned to England in poverty. She had spent all her money on her medical work and on supplies for soldiers, and unlike military doctors, and even unlike Florence Nightingale, she received no pension or recognition from the British government. She had to rely on public fundraising to avoid destitution. And while Florence Nightingale became famous and celebrated as the founder of modern nursing, Mary Seacole was largely forgotten. Her contributions were not taught in nursing schools, her techniques were not studied or preserved, and her name faded from memory until historians in recent decades began to recover her story and recognize her achievements. Let me tell you about Margaret Ann Bulkley, because her story reveals the extremes that some women went to in order to practice medicine when being female meant automatic exclusion. According to research by Professor Michael Du Preez from South Africa, whose biography examines Bulkley's life, Margaret was born in Ireland around 1789 and desperately wanted to study medicine. Since women were prohibited from attending medical school, Margaret made an extraordinary decision. She disguised herself as a man, took the name James Barry, and lived the rest of her life presenting as male in order to practice medicine. Professor Du Preez's research reveals that James Barry, as Margaret was known, attended medical school in Edinburgh, graduated as a physician, joined the British Army Medical Service, and had a distinguished 50-year career as a military doctor. Barry rose to the rank of Inspector General, the second highest medical position in the British Army, and served in South Africa, Canada, the Caribbean, and other British colonies, reforming medical care, improving sanitation and hygiene in military hospitals, performing one of the first successful caesarean sections in Africa, where both mother and baby survived, and advocating for better treatment of patients, including prisoners, enslaved people, and mentally ill patients. According to Professor Du Preez, Barry's medical practice was innovative and effective. Barry insisted on clean water, proper ventilation, and good nutrition for hospital patients, when other military doctors ignored these factors. Barry performed surgeries that other doctors wouldn't attempt and had high success rates. Barry challenged senior officers who provided inadequate medical care and advocated fiercely for patients' welfare, even when this made powerful enemies. And Barry did all of this while maintaining the male disguise that allowed practice binding breasts, keeping distance from other men who might discover the deception, and living with the constant fear that discovery would end the career that was Barry's entire life. Think about what Margaret Ann Bulkley sacrificed to practice medicine. She gave up any possibility of marriage, children, intimate relationships, anything that might expose her biological sex. She lived in constant fear of discovery and the scandal and professional ruin that would follow. She had to perform masculinity convincingly enough to fool military colleagues and superiors for 50 years. She endured the discomfort of binding her body and the isolation of maintaining such a fundamental secret. And she did all of this because being a physician mattered so much that she was willing to give up her identity as a woman, to live as someone she wasn't, to sacrifice everything else for the chance to practice medicine. Professor Dupree's research reveals that the truth about James Barry was only discovered after death in 1865, when the woman who prepared the body for burial noticed female anatomy and evidence of pregnancy at some point in the past. The British Army tried to suppress this information because it was embarrassing that they had been fooled for 50 years and because acknowledging that a woman had been one of their most successful physicians would undermine all their arguments for excluding women from medicine. For decades, Barry's achievements were minimized, and Barry's story was treated as a scandalous curiosity rather than as evidence that women could excel at medicine if given the chance. Now, let me tell you about Rebecca Lee Crumpler, because her story shows the specific challenges faced by black women who wanted to practice medicine in America. According to research by Professor Vanessa Northington Gamble from George Washington University, whose work examines African American medical history, Rebecca Lee Crumpler became the first African American woman to earn a medical degree in the United States when she graduated from New England Female Medical College in 1864. This was during the Civil War, and Rebecca had to overcome not just the gender barriers that all women faced in medicine, but also the racial barriers that excluded black people from most professional opportunities. Professor Gamble's research reveals that Rebecca Lee Crumpler specialized in treating women and children, particularly poor women and children, and newly freed enslaved people who had no access to medical care. After the Civil War, she moved to Richmond, Virginia, to provide medical care to freed people through the Freedmen's Bureau, working in conditions of extreme poverty and facing hostility from white physicians and white patients who objected to a black woman claiming medical authority. She treated patients who had never had access to medical care, who suffered from malnutrition and untreated diseases, who desperately needed help that no one else was providing. According to Professor Gamble, Rebecca Crumpler wrote a medical book in 1883 called A Book of Medical Discourses. That was one of the first medical texts published by an African-American author. The book provided medical advice specifically for women and children, with particular attention to the health needs of African-American families who faced discrimination in accessing healthcare. It documented treatments and advice based on her years of practice, preserving medical knowledge that was specifically adapted to the populations she served. But like so much of women's medical writing, her book was largely ignored by the mainstream medical establishment and forgotten until historians recovered it decades later. Think about the compounding barriers that women like Rebecca Crumpler faced. She had to overcome gender discrimination to get medical education. She had to overcome racial discrimination that made her practice even more precarious than white women physicians faced. She served populations that white physicians refused to treat, working in conditions of poverty and facing hostility from white medical authorities. And after all of this, Her contributions were erased from medical history. Her book was forgotten, and her pioneering work was not recognized or celebrated. She faced every possible obstacle, and she practiced medicine anyway because people needed help, and she had the knowledge and skill to help them. Let me tell you about Dorothea Exelban, because her story from 18th century Germany illustrates how some women fought legally for the right to practice medicine. According to research by Professor Claudia Wiesmann from the University of Göttingen, whose work examines Exelban's life, Dorothea was born in Germany in 1715 and was educated in medicine by her father, who was a physician. She wanted to practice medicine professionally, but women were prohibited from attending university or obtaining medical licenses. In 1741, Dorothea petitioned King Frederick II of Prussia for permission to attend medical school, arguing that her knowledge and skill qualified her and that preventing her from practicing was unjust. Professor Wiesmann's research reveals that King Frederick granted Dorothea permission to attend medical lectures at the University of Halle, a remarkable concession, though Dorothea still faced enormous obstacles. She had to interrupt her studies to marry and have children. Her husband was a widower with 5 children, and they had 4 more children together, and she faced hostility from male students and professors who objected to her presence. Local physicians who saw her as competition accused her of practicing medicine illegally, and in 1753 she had to defend herself against these charges by writing a dissertation and passing oral examinations to prove her medical knowledge. According to Professor Wiesmann, Dorothea Exelban successfully defended her dissertation in 1754, becoming the first woman in Germany to earn a medical doctorate. Her dissertation, titled "A Thorough Investigation of the Causes Preventing the Female Sex from Studying," argued that women were intellectually capable of studying medicine, and that excluding them was based on prejudice rather than rational grounds. After earning her degree, Dorothea practiced medicine for 8 more years until her death in 1762, treating patients and demonstrating that women could be competent physicians, despite all the arguments to the contrary. Think about what Dorothea Exelban had to do to practice medicine. She had to petition the king for special permission. She had to endure hostility and harassment from male colleagues. She had to interrupt her education for marriage and motherhood, while also caring for 9 children. She had to defend herself against legal accusations and prove her competence through examinations that male physicians didn't have to pass. And she had to write a dissertation arguing for the basic principle that women were capable of learning medicine. Every step of her path to becoming a physician required fighting battles that male physicians never faced, and her success came from extraordinary persistence and courage. Now let me tell you about traditional birth attendants in developing countries today, because the dangerous healings that women perform in secret continue in parts of the world where access to modern healthcare is limited. According to research by Professor Marsden Wagner from the World Health Organization, whose work examines global maternal health, traditional birth attendants, women who attend births and provide maternal health care using traditional knowledge passed down through generations, serve as the primary source of maternal care for millions of women worldwide. In many regions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, 60 to 80% of births are attended by traditional birth attendants, rather than by trained medical professionals. Professor Wagner's research reveals that traditional birth attendants possess practical knowledge of childbirth gained through attending hundreds of births, and in many cases their practices are effective as they support women through labour, they use positioning and massage to facilitate birth. They know how to handle common complications, and they provide culturally appropriate care that respects women's preferences and traditions. Studies have shown that when traditional birth attendants receive basic training in hygienic practices and emergency recognition, outcomes can be as good as or better than outcomes with less experienced hospital staff, and women often prefer traditional birth attendants because they provide continuous support and care in familiar settings. According to Professor Wagner, traditional birth attendants face some of the same challenges that female healers historically faced. They are often stigmatized by trained medical professionals who see them as ignorant or dangerous. They practice with minimal resources and support. They are blamed when outcomes are bad, even though they are often dealing with high-risk situations, with no access to emergency medical care, and efforts to improve maternal health sometimes focus on eliminating traditional birth attendants rather than on supporting and training them. The same pattern of devaluing women's traditional medical knowledge and trying to replace it with male-dominated professional medicine continues today. Professor Wagner's research reveals that the most successful programs for improving maternal health in areas served by traditional birth attendants have been programs that respect and work with these practitioners rather than trying to eliminate them. Training traditional birth attendants in hygienic practices, providing them with basic supplies like clean delivery kits, creating referral networks so they can transfer high-risk cases to medical facilities, and recognizing their expertise and role in their communities has improved maternal health outcomes while preserving traditional knowledge and culturally appropriate care practices. Think about how this connects to everything we've discussed tonight. Women's traditional healing knowledge is still being practiced, still serving communities that need care, still facing stigma and devaluation from professional medicine, and still demonstrating that women's experiential knowledge has value that deserves to be respected rather than dismissed. The dangerous healings that women perform in secret continue dangerous because of limited resources and lack of support, dangerous because of stigma and legal barriers, and dangerous because women healers continue to be blamed for failures of entire healthcare systems, rather than being supported as the skilled practitioners they are. Let me tell you one final story about a contemporary woman healer whose work embodies the themes we've explored tonight. According to research by Professor Paul Farmer from Harvard Medical School, whose work examines global health equity, Dr. Hawa Abdi was a Somali physician who ran a hospital and refugee camp in Somalia for over 20 years, providing healthcare to people displaced by civil war and famine. She trained as a physician when few Somali women could access medical education, and she dedicated her career to serving the poorest and most vulnerable people in one of the world's most dangerous places. Professor Farmer's research reveals that Dr. Hawa Abdi faced extraordinary dangers in her work. She was threatened by warlords who wanted to take over her hospital. She was held at gunpoint by armed militias. She refused to leave even when her life was in danger because her patients had no one else to help them. She provided medical care in conditions of extreme scarcity, lacking basic supplies, equipment, and medicine, but improvising and making do with whatever she had. She trained her daughters to be physicians so that the work could continue, and together they served over 100,000 people over 2 decades, providing not just medical care but also shelter, food, and protection to displaced people who had lost everything. According to Professor Farmer, Dr. Hawa Abdi's work demonstrates the same courage, compassion, and commitment that women healers throughout history have shown. She risked her life to provide care when no one else would. She practiced medicine under impossible conditions with limited resources. She stood up to armed men who threatened her, refusing to abandon her patients. She trained the next generation to continue the work, and she did all of this while facing the specific dangers that women healers face: gender-based violence, dismissal of her authority, threats to her safety as a woman working in a male-dominated conflict zone. Think about what Dr. Hawa Abdi's story reveals about the continuity of women's healing work. From medieval midwives to traditional birth attendants to contemporary physicians working in conflict zones, women have always provided care in dangerous conditions, have always served the most vulnerable populations, have always risked their own safety to help others, and have always faced specific dangers because they are women claiming authority and expertise in healthcare. The circumstances change, but the pattern persists. Women heal, women face danger for healing, Women persist despite the danger because people need help. As we truly come to the end of this long journey through centuries of women's dangerous healings, you should feel a profound appreciation for the women who preserved and transmitted medical knowledge despite persecution, who practiced healing despite the mortal dangers they faced, who fought for the right to medicine when they were systematically excluded, and who continue today to provide care in conditions of danger and with limited support. These women, from unnamed medieval herbalists to famous physicians like Elizabeth Blackwell, to contemporary traditional birth attendants, to physicians like Dr. Hawa Abdi, all share the courage to heal despite danger, the commitment to helping others despite personal risk, and the resilience to persist despite systematic suppression of their work. You've learned tonight about the worst of human nature, the persecution and torture and execution of women for possessing and practicing medical knowledge, the systematic suppression of expertise for reasons of gender and racial prejudice, the loss of accumulated wisdom through deliberate destruction of knowledge. But you've also learned about the best of human nature, the courage of women who risked everything to help others, the persistence of knowledge despite efforts to destroy it, the gradual but real progress toward recognizing women's contributions to medicine, and the ongoing work of contemporary women healers who carry forward centuries of tradition while also advancing medical knowledge and practice. As you finally drift into sleep, carry with you these final thoughts. The women healers throughout history were not victims. They were practitioners, experts, teachers, innovators, and courageous providers of care who refused to let danger stop them from using their knowledge and skills to help others. Their knowledge was real, their skills were effective, their courage was extraordinary, and their legacy continues in every woman who provides healthcare today, in every person who values traditional healing knowledge alongside modern medicine, and in every effort to make healthcare more equitable, accessible, and responsive to all people's needs regardless of gender, race, or economic status. May you sleep peacefully tonight knowing that knowledge and skill ultimately cannot be completely destroyed. That truth eventually emerges even after centuries of suppression, that courage and compassion persist across generations, and that the work of healing continues despite all obstacles. May you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the women healers who came before us, renewed commitment to honouring their legacy, and renewed understanding that healthcare is better when it includes all voices, respects all traditions, and recognises that women have always been healers, and always will be, regardless of what barriers are placed in their path. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may you remember that the dangerous healings women performed in secret throughout history were not dangerous because they harmed people. They were dangerous because they challenged power, because they demonstrated women's competence and authority, because they met needs that patriarchal systems wanted to ignore or control. The danger came from challenging systems of oppression, not from the healing itself. And that makes these women not just healers, but also revolutionaries, not just practitioners, but also rebels, not just caregivers, but also freedom fighters who insisted on their right to use their knowledge and skills to help others regardless of what systems of power tried to stop them. Rest well, and may the courage, wisdom, and compassion of countless women healers across history inspire your dreams and inform your waking life. They practiced dangerous healings in secret because healing was more important than safety, because helping others mattered more than protecting themselves, because knowledge and skill are meant to be used even when using them is dangerous. May we all have even a fraction of their courage, a portion of their wisdom, and a share of their commitment to helping others regardless of personal cost. As you settle into sleep, I want you to think one more time about the specific knowledge that was lost when women healers were suppressed, because understanding what we lost helps us appreciate what we've struggled to regain. According to research by Professor Monica Green from Arizona State University, whose work examines medieval medical texts, when we analyze surviving medical manuscripts from medieval Europe, we can see evidence of women's medical knowledge even in texts that were copied and transmitted by men. Marginal notes, recipe collections, and practical observations that differ from the main theoretical text often represent women's empirical knowledge that was added to otherwise academic manuscripts, showing that women's healing wisdom influenced even the official medical tradition that excluded them. Professor Green's research reveals that women's medical knowledge was especially sophisticated in areas related to women's bodies and reproduction, which makes sense given that women healers had access to women's bodies and women's experiences in ways that male physicians didn't. Medieval texts on gynecology and obstetrics show clear evidence of being influenced by women's practical knowledge, even when they were written by male authors. The details about symptoms, the practical advice about management, the realistic understanding of what women experience all suggest that male authors were incorporating knowledge they learned from women healers, even if they didn't credit those women or acknowledge that they were learning from practitioners they officially dismissed as ignorant. According to Professor Green, when we lose women's medical knowledge, we lose not just specific remedies and techniques, but entire ways of understanding health and illness. Women healers understood health holistically, as involving body, mind, emotions, social relationships, and spiritual well-being. They understood that healing required addressing the whole person and the person's environment, not just treating isolated symptoms or diseases. They understood that care and compassion were therapeutic in themselves, not just preludes to actual medical treatment. And they understood that patients' own knowledge of their bodies and their experiences was valuable information that should inform treatment, not just noise to be ignored in favor of the physician's theoretical knowledge. Think about what modern medicine might look like if women's healing traditions had been preserved and integrated, rather than suppressed and replaced. We might have developed earlier the understanding that social determinants affect health, that mental and emotional states influence physical health, that patients' experiences and preferences matter in treatment decisions, that caregiving and support are central to healing, not peripheral to it. These insights are being rediscovered in modern medicine through fields like psychoneuroimmunology, patient-centered care, and social epidemiology. But women healers knew these things through empirical observation centuries before modern medical science caught up. Let me tell you about one more area where women's medical knowledge was particularly sophisticated, and where its loss set medicine back significantly: the understanding of pain and pain management. According to research by Professor Roselyne Ray from the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in France, whose work examines the history of pain, women healers had nuanced understanding of different types of pain, of how pain affects different people differently, of how to assess and manage pain using both pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical approaches. They understood that pain had physical, emotional, and social dimensions, and they addressed all of these in their treatment approaches. Professor Ray's research reveals that women healers used multiple strategies for pain management that modern pain medicine is only now recognizing as valid. They used positioning and movement to manage pain, understanding that sometimes rest helps pain and sometimes movement helps, that proper positioning can reduce pain from injuries or illness, that gentle movement and massage can relieve muscle and joint pain. They used heat and cold therapeutically, hot compresses for some types of pain, cold for others, understanding through observation which worked better in different situations. They used distraction, relaxation, and psychological support to help patients cope with pain-talking patients through painful procedures, providing comfort and reassurance, helping patients find meaning in their suffering. According to Professor Ray, women healers also understood that pain assessment required listening to patients and believing their reports of pain, rather than assuming that the healer knew better than the patient how much pain they were experiencing. This seems obvious, but male physicians historically often dismissed patients' pain reports, especially women's pain reports, assuming that patients exaggerated or that women were naturally more sensitive and complaining. Women healers who had experienced pain themselves, who had attended many patients in pain, who listened to other women's descriptions of their pain, developed more sophisticated understanding of pain's subjective nature and of the importance of believing and validating patients' pain experiences. Think about how much suffering might have been prevented if this knowledge about pain and pain management had been preserved and built upon, rather than dismissed and lost. For centuries, European medicine had little effective pain relief. Patients endured agonizing surgeries without anesthesia. Women suffered through childbirth without pain relief. People with chronic pain had few options for managing it. Women healers had knowledge that could have helped, but that knowledge was suppressed because it came from women, because it was empirical rather than theoretical, because it challenged the dominance of male physicians who had less effective treatments. Now let me tell you about the psychological toll that suppressing women's medical knowledge took on individual women healers, because understanding the personal costs helps us honour these women's courage and persistence. According to research by Professor Laura Gowing from King's College London, whose work examines women's lives in early modern England, women who possessed medical knowledge but had to hide it or practice it in secret experienced enormous stress and internal conflict. They knew they had skills that could help people, but using those skills could destroy their lives. They witnessed suffering they knew how to alleviate, but helping could expose them to accusation. They possessed knowledge passed down from their mothers and grandmothers, but passing it on to the next generation could endanger their daughters. Professor Gowing's research reveals stories of women who chose to let their medical knowledge die with them rather than pass it on and potentially endanger their daughters or granddaughters. Women who destroyed their recipe books and household medical manuals when witch hunts intensified in their regions, preferring to lose the knowledge than to have it used as evidence against them or their families. Women who pretended ignorance when they could have helped, choosing safety over service. The suppression of women's medical knowledge involved not just external violence and exclusion, but also internal silencing, as women made agonizing choices between preserving knowledge and protecting themselves and their families. According to Professor Gowing, some women experienced what we would now recognize as moral injury from these situations, the psychological damage that comes from being forced to act against your deeply held values. Women who were healers by training and by calling, who understood their knowledge as a responsibility to help others, who felt called to ease suffering when they could, experience deep distress when they had to choose between their safety and their sense of moral duty. Some became depressed or bitter. Some withdrew from their communities. Some continued practicing despite the dangers because they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't help when they could. Think about the complexity of these women's situations. You have knowledge that could save lives, but using it could cost you your life. You witness suffering, you know how to alleviate, but alleviating it could lead to your execution. You possess wisdom passed down through generations of women, but passing it on could endanger the next generation. There are no good choices, only different varieties of loss and different distributions of risk. Women who faced these situations weren't just being courageous when they chose to heal, despite the dangers. They were making agonizing moral decisions that would haunt them regardless of what they chose. Let me tell you about the role of written recipes and oral traditions in preserving women's medical knowledge despite suppression. According to research by Professor Elaine Leong from University College London, whose work examines recipe books and household medical manuscripts, women used multiple strategies to preserve and transmit medical knowledge in ways that were relatively safe. They embedded medical recipes within household recipe books alongside cooking recipes, making medical knowledge look like ordinary domestic knowledge rather than professional medical practice. They passed knowledge orally from mother to daughter, from midwife to apprentice, creating chains of transmission that didn't require literacy or written records that could be used as evidence. They coded knowledge in ways that looked innocent to outsiders, but that knowledgeable women could decode and understand. Professor Leong's research reveals that household recipe books and household medical manuscripts that survive from the early modern period show evidence of sophisticated medical knowledge embedded in domestic formats. A recipe for a cough syrup sits next to a recipe for gingerbread. A treatment for infections appears alongside instructions for pickling vegetables. Advice on managing difficult births is interleaved with advice on managing servants. To an outsider, these books look like ordinary household management records, but to women who knew how to read them, they were comprehensive medical manuals documenting effective treatments for a wide range of conditions, techniques for procedures from setting bones to managing hemorrhages, and accumulated wisdom about what worked in practice. According to Professor Leong, women also used code words and euphemisms to disguise the nature of medical knowledge. Recipes for contraceptives and abortifacients were labelled as treatments for obstructed menses or for bringing down the flowers. Language that looked innocuous, but that knowledgeable women understood referred to preventing or ending pregnancy. Treatments that used potentially dangerous plants like belladonna or henbane were described vaguely enough that the reader had to already know what was meant, protecting the writer if the manuscript was discovered while still preserving the knowledge for those who had been taught how to interpret it. Think about the cleverness required to preserve knowledge under these conditions. Women had to disguise medical expertise as domestic competence, had to write about healing in ways that looked innocent, had to create coded language that transmitted knowledge to the initiated while protecting the writer from accusation. This required not just medical skill, but also linguistic creativity, strategic thinking, and deep understanding of the dangers they faced and how to navigate them. The fact that any medical knowledge survived from women healers despite centuries of suppression is testament to women's determination to preserve and transmit what they knew, despite all obstacles. Let me tell you about the connection between women's medical knowledge and women's economic independence, because understanding this connection illuminates another reason why women healers were suppressed. According to research by Professor Mary Wiesner Hanks from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, whose work examines women's work in early modern Europe, women who practiced healing could earn money, could support themselves and their families, could accumulate property and wealth, and could therefore achieve some economic independence from men. This economic independence was threatening to patriarchal social structures that depended on women's economic dependence on fathers, husbands, and other male relatives. Professor Wiesner Hanks's research reveals that successful women healers could be quite prosperous. They charged fees for their services, they sold medicines, they compounded, they received gifts and payments from grateful patients, and the most successful could earn more than many male craftsmen. This economic success gave them power and independence. They could choose whether to marry, they could support themselves if widowed, they could inherit and control property. They could make economic decisions without male oversight, and this independence threatened social order in ways that male authorities found intolerable. According to Professor Wiesner Hanks, the suppression of women's medical practice was partly about transferring this income and economic opportunity from women to men. When women were prohibited from practicing medicine and male physicians took over their patients, the fees and income that had gone to women went to men instead. When medical guilds excluded women and required licensing that women couldn't obtain, they were creating male monopolies on medical practice and medical income. The witch hunts and the professionalization of medicine weren't just about medical authority. They were also about economics, about ensuring that healing as an occupation enriched men rather than providing economic opportunities for women. Think about how this economic motive shaped the suppression of women healers. It wasn't just that women weren't supposed to have medical knowledge. It was that women weren't supposed to earn money, own property, or have economic independence. Successful women healers violated these expectations and demonstrated that women could support themselves without men, that they could accumulate wealth and property, that they could be economically independent and powerful. This was intolerable to patriarchal systems, and eliminating women healers was partly about eliminating examples of female economic independence and ensuring that women remained economically dependent on men. Now let me tell you about the contemporary legacies of the suppression of women's medical knowledge, because understanding how this history continues to affect healthcare today helps us recognize ongoing problems and work towards solutions. According to research by Professor Patricia A. Gans from UCLA, whose work examines gender bias in medicine and medical research, modern medicine still shows effects of the centuries when women were excluded from medical practice and when women's medical knowledge was suppressed and dismissed. Medical research has historically focused on male bodies and male experiences, treating women's bodies as variations from the male norm. Medical education has often minimized conditions that primarily affect women, or has taught that women's symptoms are psychological rather than physical, and medical practice still shows patterns of dismissing women's pain reports, minimizing women's symptoms, and attributing women's health problems to anxiety or hysteria rather than to physical causes. Professor Gans's research reveals specific examples of how the exclusion of women from medicine harmed women's health. Heart disease research focused on men for decades, despite heart disease being a leading cause of death for women, leading to delayed recognition that women's heart attack symptoms often differ from men's, and that treatments developed and tested primarily on men might not work as well for women. Drug trials excluded women for years, leading to medications being prescribed at doses that were too high for women's generally smaller body sizes and different metabolisms. Medical conditions that primarily affect women, like endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome, received far less research funding and attention than conditions affecting similar numbers of men. According to Professor Gans, women's pain is still taken less seriously than men's pain in medical settings. Women wait longer in emergency rooms, receive less pain medication, are more likely to have their pain attributed to emotional or psychological causes rather than physical causes. Women's symptoms are more likely to be dismissed as exaggeration or attention-seeking. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with mental health conditions when they actually have physical illnesses, and more likely to have physical symptoms attributed to stress or anxiety. These patterns reflect centuries of cultural conditioning that women's bodies are mysterious, that women's complaints are unreliable, that women exaggerate suffering, beliefs that served to delegitimize women healers' expertise and to justify male medical authority over women's bodies. Think about how different healthcare might be if women's healing traditions had been preserved and valued. If holistic understanding of health had remained central to medicine instead of being dismissed as unscientific. If listening to patients' experiences and believing their reports had remained standard practice, instead of being replaced by exclusive reliance on physician expertise and technological testing. If caregiving and support had been recognized as central to healing, instead of being devalued as merely nursing or social work rather than real medicine. If women's medical knowledge about women's bodies had been systematically documented and built upon rather than dismissed and suppressed. Let me tell you about contemporary efforts to recover and honor women's healing traditions, because understanding current work to reclaim this history offers hope and demonstrates continuing relevance. According to research by Professor Dina Howitz from the University of Virginia, whose work examines traditional healing and human rights, there are growing movements worldwide to document traditional healing knowledge, to recognize traditional healers as legitimate healthcare providers, to integrate traditional and modern medicine in ways that respect both systems, and to acknowledge the primarily female practitioners who have preserved traditional healing knowledge despite suppression. Professor Howitz's research reveals that in many countries, governments and health organizations are working to document traditional medical knowledge before it is completely lost, to train traditional healers in hygienic practices and emergency recognition while respecting their traditional knowledge, and to create systems where traditional healers and modern medical practitioners work together rather than in opposition. These efforts recognize that traditional healing knowledge much of it preserved and transmitted by women, has real value for community health. That traditional healers often serve populations that modern healthcare doesn't reach, and that the goal should be integration and collaboration rather than elimination of traditional healing. According to Professor Howitz, there are also growing efforts within modern medicine to recover aspects of healing practice that were lost when medicine professionalized and excluded women. The hospice movement, which emphasizes holistic care for dying patients and their families, draws on healing traditions that women maintained when male medicine focused exclusively on cure rather than care. The movement toward patient-centered care, which emphasizes listening to patients and involving them in treatment decisions, recovers principles that women healers practiced. The recognition that social determinants affect health returns to holistic understanding that women healers maintained when male physicians focused only on physical pathology. Think about what these recovery efforts mean. They represent recognition that knowledge suppressed for being women's knowledge actually had value that modern medicine needs. They represent acknowledgement that professionalized medicine lost important dimensions of healing when it excluded women and dismissed women's healing traditions. They represent hope that we can integrate the best of traditional healing knowledge with the best of modern medical science, creating healthcare that is more effective, more holistic, and more responsive to all patients' needs. And they represent honoring the women healers who preserved knowledge despite suppression, who maintained healing traditions despite danger, and who passed wisdom to the next generation despite all efforts to eliminate them. As you truly drift into sleep now, after this long and complex journey through women's healing history, I want you to rest with a sense of both grief and hope. Grief for all that was lost, the knowledge destroyed, the women killed, the suffering that could have been prevented, the wisdom that died with women who couldn't or wouldn't pass it on for fear of endangering others. Grief for the women who had to hide their skills, who had to watch suffering they could alleviate but dared not address, who had to choose between healing and safety, who paid terrible prices for practicing medicine when being female made healing dangerous. But also hope because knowledge ultimately cannot be completely destroyed as long as someone values it and works to preserve it. Hope because truth eventually emerges even after centuries of suppression. Hope because women fought their way back into medicine despite centuries of exclusion and are now present and increasingly recognized in all medical fields. Hope because traditional healing knowledge is being documented and valued instead of merely dismissed and destroyed. Hope because modern medicine is slowly recognizing and recovering some of what was lost when women's healing traditions were suppressed. Hope because the dangerous healings women performed in secret throughout history are finally being recognized not as witchcraft or ignorant superstition, but as real medical practice deserving of respect and study. May you sleep deeply and peacefully, knowing that the courage and wisdom of women healers throughout history lives on in every person who provides compassionate care, who preserves traditional knowledge, who challenges medical hierarchies and advocates for better care for all patients, and who recognizes that healthcare is better when it includes all voices and respects all traditions. May you wake tomorrow with renewed understanding of how gender, power, and knowledge intersect in medicine, with deeper appreciation for the women who fought to preserve healing knowledge despite all obstacles, and with commitment to honoring their legacy through your own actions in the world. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may you remember that the women who performed dangerous healings in secret throughout history were not just healers but also teachers, preservers of wisdom, rebels against oppression, and pioneers who made possible the greater gender equity in medicine that we're still working to achieve. They healed because healing mattered more than safety. They preserved knowledge because that knowledge was precious and deserved to be saved. They persisted because people needed help and they had the skills to provide it. May we all embody even a fraction of their courage, their wisdom, and their unwavering commitment to helping others regardless of personal cost. Good night, sleep deeply, dream beautifully, and wake refreshed to honor their legacy. Sweet dreams, and good night.